There's a lot of threads I think we want to bring together in this podcast, but the best place to start is with Jonathan Haidt and his complaint about social media. Of course, for the audience, Jonathan Haidt writes a lot about, how social media is bad. And to illustrate his point, he uses a certain metaphor, the metaphor of the Tower of Babel. Uh, in the Bible, the Tower of Babel is a great tower that mankind is building theoretically to heaven to rival God. It's this great tower, it's amazing, and then God comes down and confuses their language. He makes people speak different languages and unable to communicate with each other. And this is why we have different languages. And Jonathan Haidt sees this and says, this is very bad. And to the extent that social media makes people split off into different communities and subcultures and metaphorical languages, some cases, really different languages or at least slang, that's bad, and we should go back to building the tower. What do you think Babel symbolizes in that telling?
Yeah, that's really great, and something that Michael Sakasas and I have been talking about for a long time. I do think Jonathan Haidt has been on a bit of a journey. It wouldn't be surprised me if he at least partially recants his sort of understanding of this. But yeah, when there's this narrative of we used to live in a world of consensus reality where we all understood each other, we could all speak to each other. And now, as the Bible says, our language is confounded, right? We can't talk to each other. If you try to watch TV or a YouTube show from somebody who has a very different political ideology, it's almost nonsensical or it's upsetting, like even just to hear it. And this is obviously bad. And yeah, I think it is worth dwelling with the Babel story a little bit more. So it's an interesting question of what is the sin of Babel? And there's a kind of very modern interpretation that it's something like humanity is rivaling God and trying to replace God. And that doesn't really hold up very well to the biblical narrative. Like, it's not clear why a building a tower to heaven would displace God. If you read the story, for one thing, it's not a tower, it's a city and a tower. It's always referred to as a city and a tower. And what is being created at Babel is one universal regime, one universal political community and linguistic community that will have a total monopoly on humanity, right? There will only be one language, only be one place. And it's that kind of gathering, a kind of a communion or the unity of mankind in a single mimetic space. We want to borrow a term from Girard that maybe we can talk about later. That's what is destructive of, and why is it destructive? Because it will draw if there's only one city and one tower for everyone, then all of mankind's attention and worship is being focused inwardly on the city. And this mission of conquering the earth ends up being everything is wilderness except for this one city. And so that's why, in the biblical narrative, that's why the language is confounded, is actually to increase diversity, as it were, to get people to actually spread out and develop their own languages, their own cultures, their own cities. And I think that's what we're seeing on the internet. I think that if you go back, it's really hard to get yourself back in the 90s mindset. But going back and reading people like Naomi Klein, even Noam Chomsky or Jon Stewart in the late 90s, early 2000s, or even better, trying to sit down with an issue of a magazine, popular magazine, or watching an hour or two of television as it was broadcast at the time. And the feeling is unbelievable mediocrity and stifling conformity. That was the classic kind of critique of the late 90s. And that's been totally destroyed by the internet. And I think the world is much more interesting now. I think our conversations are more interesting. I think our ideas of what's good are becoming much more pluralistic. And so for all the other problems the internet might create, one of the best things about it is precisely that it destroyed the tower and city that we were trying to build in the late 1990s.
Yeah, if you go back to the critique of even as late as the Obama administration, it was the two parties, it's the uniparty. It's just the same. Obama, Romney, they're just the same guy. They're not working for you, and that feeds into what comes next. But the idea that the two parties are too similar, I think very few people believe that today. And part of that is because of the internet. Part of it is because I think they are genuinely very different. Can that be disentangled at all? How do you think about those two things?
Yeah, I think there is an interesting question of how much is the media environment, how much of it is real political change in political circumstances. And of course, the reality is often is both. But I do think it's interesting if you go back at least in American history, in the cycles of a media's sort of rise to political preeminence, political domination, and then fall, there seems to be a moment in the kind of on the upswing of the medium's rise where it leads to a kind of political unity. So you have this at the moment that television reaches its sort of height of its powers in the mid 90s. You also have the 96 election. The Clinton Dole election is probably had some of the lowest turnout, some of the lowest enthusiasm of any election in modern history because it was seen as quite marginal. And by the way, this goes part and parcel with the alienation of different parts of the quote unquote extremes of the left and the right within those parties, right? There's a brand new oral history of the Days of Rage, the battle for Seattle in 1999, the World Trade Organization, where a World WTO meeting was shut down by protesters, basically. And what's interesting about this oral history is it reveals that this protest was driven by obviously people you'd expect in the left, anarchists, unions, etc., but also a number of kind of old money conservative interests, including people who had been John Birchers, who had funded Pat Buchanan, who were also concerned about globalization and actually funded sort of these far left groups to disrupt the meeting in Seattle. But you can go back to a similar moment, I think, in the 50s and 60s when the newspaper is at its height of its powers. And I think even, yeah, I think there's been a few of these cycles where there's a confluence of the stability of a political alignment and a medium that leads to this sort of feeling of stagnation almost of political unity. And then it splits apart again as a new medium arises.
Oh, absolutely. If you apply that narrative simply and ask yourself, where's the social media unity? Was that Obama? Was that Trump? Was that Biden and censoring the Hunter Biden laptop? Like, where did it happen? Did it happen?
I think it's an interesting question of what is social media. And one interesting answer that I'm cribbing notes from my friend James Poulos is that all social media is an attempt to social media is television meets the internet, right? Yes, you're using the same kinds of affordances. You're using internet many communications, but you're reassembling it into a platform and a stream that creates many of the kind of, for example, the way that the early influencer economy worked is quite similar to the way the reality TV works. There's a really interesting essay by David Foster Wallace in 1993, I think. It's famous for laying out this idea of the new sincerity, the way that in the 90s people were moving to post irony. They were searching for the ability to speak meaningfully in a way that had been lost in the hyper televisual saturation of the 90s. What's interesting about it, though, is that the essay is actually a response to a book by George Gilder, prophesying a world in which essentially using computers, everyone could have their own TV channel. That's the world that social media built. And I think we're only now arriving at truly internet native. The internet is a native medium. And what's central to that, I think, is precisely the fragmentation, the sense that you are localizing into audiences. It's actually a move from the audience back to the community. And the difference between audience and the community is the audience implies a kind of stage. The audience implies a stage in a way that a community doesn't. And I think that's we're rebuilding politics, businesses, art, culture on actual communities of interaction where the people actually know each other via the internet. And we're moving past the audience paradigm in a sense. But that's only, I think, it's still a very nascent movement.
Yeah, I think that the concept of a stage, you're right in that it's more of an inherent premise. It's easier to get lost in the social media version than the television version, but at the same time, there is a stage that becomes a lot more visible. I think that we've both lived through a turning of the political tide where I think a lot of Silicon Valley investors, many of which we know, really saw the kind of pre-Trump establishments fading away. Their control over information, either through mainstream television, through manipulation of social media algorithms, this was a kind of stage, and it was very clear, it was very distinct, and it was the enemy. It was the number one enemy, much more than Kamala Harris, much more than Joe Biden, Nancy Pelosi could be. Because that stage was something that had control over them. It had control over them over the television era. And so much of the authenticity of the social media age is rebelling against that stage, rebelling against the stage of TV. Where does that leave us? Where does that leave us with this kind of community versus stage element?
One thing I think it's important to recognize is, and this gets to the problem, my problem with Jonathan Haidt, is that this kind of power, and part of what is defeating it, is it's becoming visible as it decays. McLuhan says something like that the power of any medium is its invisibility. Right? The more that it becomes the invisible background that conditions everything, the more powerful it is. Television is most powerful in the 60s and 70s, and then rising in intensity in the 80s and 90s, as it is the context of no context, as one New Yorker essay called it. When it becomes visible as television, and this is what I think Jon Stewart achieved, then it's beginning to lose its power. The same thing I think happens with social media. The heyday of the kind of power of social media, it's merging with late television in the 2010s. But as that power becomes resisted by other parts of the kind of internet culture, that it becomes more visible. So I've been rereading some of the old Nick Land Xenosystems blog posts. Passage Press just put out a great edition of Xenosystems, and some of them, these are blog posts from the heyday of kind of neo-reaction, dark enlightenment, the earliest inklings of what I think now is ascendant as kind of the tech right. And some of it's quite dated in that sense, but some of it seems, from the standpoint of today, enormously prophetic. So I want to read from, this is from an essay called Cathedral Decay, or a blog post, Cathedral Decay. This blog, Nick Land, strongly suspects that the cathedral has become an object of animosity as a consequence of its morbidity. After all, it's a mind control apparatus. If it's no longer universally accepted and in certain problematic patches actively loathed, dysfunction is clearly indicated. A contestation of its story is not supposed to be part of the story. And then this is the end of that post. It's like a short post.
The fact that there are other player characters breaks immersion.
Exactly. So even amidst the stupidity of the degenerating political cycle, another blogger named Fernandez, he notices that, quote, the current crop of Republican presidential candidates are openly breaking with the really important modern faith, the media-led church that has held mainstream politics together for so long. The integrative media is fatally sick. That neo-reaction exists at all is a sign of that. And he's writing this in October 2015, just before Donald Trump's ascendance in the political primaries, and then victory, and then winning the presidency.
Yeah, in a sense, it's a very interesting order. I always think that order has significance, and the order of breaking with the mainstream is media-led. It's either Tucker or it's Rush Limbaugh radio, and then to some degree it's the politicians, it's the Tea Party, and finally it's the kind of elite class, right? It's like broadcast media. It's not really like literary elite. And in fact, the literary elite in many ways still haven't broken with the mainstream, right? What is it? The Bulwark, the National Review. Many of them maintain their allegiance to the mainstream. And there's something, maybe one theory about this order is that it's kind of proximity to print media. But yeah, what's your theory on the order? Do you think it has significance?
That's an interesting question. Yeah, I do think that these political changes we're living through are to some extent downstream of the affordances of internet communities. And the more online you are, the more steeped in this you are. It doesn't necessarily determine your politics one way or another, but the more it becomes impossible to see the world via the kind of broadcast television picture.
But the Bulwark people are more online than the senator from, the senator from Idaho or something, right?
But they're also more steep. I think you're right that some of this is proximity to print culture. Amongst politicians I talked to, I think there's sort of two flavors. One of them are a flavor that are actually themselves quite online, or many politicians are very careful observers of people. And as they spot a kind of trend, as they spot a movement amongst their constituents, they're quick to try to figure it out. There's that. The other part are frankly people who are just not that. They're followers. They're not on the leading edge, and they're savvy enough, and they have the right consultants to tell them what's becoming politically popular. But I wouldn't say that they're, even on the Republican Party today, outside of those who could have been primary, there are still plenty of people who are essentially remained sort of Bush era GOP types until very late in the game. I would not say that they were early adopters in many cases.
Fair enough. And so the story there is proximity to the internet and this kind of multiplayer system. We've talked about this in a previous episode. I highly recommend all of our listeners listen to that if they're confused about this going forward. But I think that a question that brings up when people are competing for points, competing for social recognition, is what that ends up producing, right? Because we see, for example, in markets, people compete to maximize shareholder value, but they also, in the process of doing that, produce all sorts of things that we are using to record this episode and that we use to communicate with each other, and that many of the things that save our lives are also produced in this process. This kind of ultimate end, this is something that I'm very curious about. What do you think is the ultimate end of social media?
I don't know. I don't know how interesting social media actually is, to be honest with you. It mostly seems like a pathway to something else.
What's it a pathway
Well,
to?
the most interesting thing about it, and Alex Kashuda had me on her podcast a year or two ago. We talked about this. And then she wrote a very good article in the American Conservative called "The Win Condition," which we can link in the show notes. The most interesting thing about social media is that it enables you. It opens mimetic portals. So the world of one of the real downsides of the world of broadcast media was that there was an explicit status hierarchy of driving mimesis. There was one explicit Bourdieusian symbolic capital generation machine. And it told you what wealthy people did, it told you what successful people did, it told you what hot, attractive people did, it told you what famous people did. And it was a sort of engine of a certain kind of limbic capitalism. And the most interesting thing I think about social media is that it breaks that for many people. And it, not necessarily in a good way, but it opens portals to many different models you can choose for your life and what counts as success, and enables you to invest in those alternative. Actually, the concept of the alternative is obsolete, because the alternative was the alternative to the mainstream. There's no mainstream anymore. There's simply different, call them ARGs, call them bespoke realities, but different models of what success looks like. For them, there's still the kind of default, I don't know what to call it. There's what remains of the mainstream with Taylor Swift and the Kardashians or whatever, and that has a certain kind of pull. But then you can fall down a portal to looks maxing on Reddit, to lifting and the baposphere, to much more intellectual pursuits, to tech bro, the rise of the technology brother as a kind of cultural paradigm. There's all these different paradigms, and you have the responsibility to choose your own mimetic models, as it were. And I think many people are increasingly explicit about that. I think maybe it's still operating in the background for people, but I think this is a really new thing in the world. There have not been many instances where your average person could actually change between one or two, more maybe one or two models. But now you're in a world where there are not infinite, but very many models to choose from, communities to become invested in, ways to think about your life and what success looks like in your life. And I think that is a quite new thing.
So underlying a lot of what we just talked about, I think you've already mentioned him a few times, Rene Girard, famously Peter Thiel's mentor and historian, philosopher, theologian, questionable theologian.
I don't know if he ever called himself a theologian, interestingly enough.
Interesting. And his idea of mimesis, that people copy each other, that this ends up creating a crisis where people need to find a scapegoat to forestall that process. Many people saw this as very predictive of social media, including Thiel, who was a student and ended up being a major, if not the biggest investor in Facebook. He saw the mimesis coming. But I think we're in a moment, like you said, we're after the mainstream. The word alternative media seems outmoded. Elon Musk says, "You are the media," pointing to Twitter, posting in Twitter, saying, "You are the mainstream media now." And this mode of, if you have a mainstream, there's something to comment on, right? It seems more difficult for these movements to form distinct things now without the mainstream. First of all, do you agree with that premise?
Yeah, I think there's what's interesting is that for all of these, call them reality communities, one of the curious things about them is that they have, you could create a kind of taxonomy of features within them, and one feature every one of them has is the hypothetical mainstream to which they are an alternative, and every one of them posits a kind of mainstream that doesn't exist anymore.
Every dissident has their own regime. Every age has its own atheists. Yeah.
Exactly. But I do think this is a fundamental issue. Some of them, as they become more powerful, they're kind of the dog that caught the car a little bit.
Yes, exactly the problem I'm pointing to.
How do you move beyond that? That's a very interesting and important question.
Or even you don't even have to move beyond it. You just have to function. You just have to do the thing the movement was meant to do.
Yes.
But the thing the movement was meant to do is dunk on the mainstream. But they are the mainstream. Who are they dunking on?
But I do wonder whether this isn't a kind of, what's the word, a spandrel or an evolutionary, what's the word for when in evolution when you move past something and it's just left hanging, a vestige.
Yeah.
This is a vestigial organ of these reality communities from when they were these like little isolated things. And I do wonder whether we won't move past it very quickly. And then each reality community will be centered on a kind of ethos or idea in the kind of older Greek sense, a fundamental image. And then it'll just try to do the thing, and it won't necessarily posit itself in relationship to some hypothetical mainstream.
Okay, so we're moving from, we are the mainstream media now. This podcast, the From the New World podcast, we are the mainstream media now.
Absolutely.
And then instead
you
of
probably
dunking,
have more listeners than MSNBC.
Yeah, maybe. I don't know. Maybe I should
a low
get the
bar.
Maddow contract. I don't know. Maddow's pretty talented. She could go the X route. We could make Crossfire great again. Elon could probably get Maddow and Tucker to record a new Crossfire. Wouldn't this be amazing?
I don't know. They wouldn't be able to talk to each other in a very fundamental, literal sense. I don't think they share enough assumptions about foundational, factual questions to actually talk to each other. But I would love to see that. This is what makes Joe Rogan so great, and the reason why he's the podcaster is that he has such a high degree of openness that he can maintain a conversation with someone. He can posit someone's factual basis for 2 or 3 hours without feeling the psychological need to assert what is factual. Most people can't do that. So I don't think they would be capable of having a conversation, much less actually having an interesting television show.
Yeah, we are truly past the time of Babel.
That's right. We're after Babel. Yeah, our language is confounded.
You sound excited for it.
I
share your excitement for it. Why are you excited for it? I think, speaking of being high openness and sharing commitments to reality, I think a lot of people they would agree with Jonathan Haidt more than they agree with us. They'd be very worried about this, scared of this. And you ask them, what's the benefit of people disagreeing more, people not even being able to understand each other, people speaking completely different languages? They can't tell you what the benefit is. Maybe you can enlighten them. Maybe you can create a little bit of shared reality. What's the benefit?
I'm Babel-ac. We're recording that here. I'm Babel. Yeah. No, it's because it's the only way to get true pluralism and therefore true innovation. The only way to actually see the world in such a different way that you can exploit possibilities things that seem impossible or seem undesirable from another perspective. So the only way to cover the search space, as it were, is with this kind of real. So especially if you view the challenge of the 21st century as finding the golden path, finding a way to remain human in a world of post-human technologies, as it were, then one of the ways to do that is to enlarge the search space for cultural, religious, civilizational ideals that might actually help us achieve that. And the danger of Babel is the danger. It's just a danger of monoculture in any situation, which is you create a single point of failure for everything. And I don't think we're going to make. Nick Land has said nothing human makes it out of the near future, and I want to take the other side of that bet, but that requires breaking the monoculture.
Yeah, it's really interesting. He said on a recent podcast, I don't remember the verbatim quote, but he really sees the human element as this kind of the human element is the negative feedback loop. It is the social pressures, the envy, the restraints, both for good and for ill, that human communities impose on each other. And that's something that I may be a bit more ambivalent than him on, but I totally see the genuine excitement of at least less of that making out of the near future, at least less of the negative feedback loops making out of the near future. I think the connection between pluralism and innovation, that's something that's very important and still, I think, underlooked within this whole storyline of the rise of the tech right. I think that once again there's this fracturing, but a lot of the mainstream or kind of even just shared narratives of different communities outside of the tech right, they say, oh, is it because of retaliation for the anti-crypto policies or anti-AI policies? Is it because of self-interest? Is it because of culture war? There's there's an internal logic that's happening on an axis that I don't think any of those communities see, which is this axis posited by Gerard, and this axis that I think has been very important in just the daily life and practice of Silicon Valley investing. Who is the underdog? What is the kind of transformational thing that will go from being insignificant, from you can buy 7% of their company for $100,000, something like that, to being Facebook, to being Google, so on and so forth. And that practice is just combing over all these crazy ideas, combing over things that you've never heard of, that you don't know anything about, that very few people in the world know anything about, often that are posited by people with no formal education, high school dropouts, the Teal Fellowship, and saying, okay, this is something that might be irrelevant, I might lose all of my money on, but could also be the seed of a kind of new reality, a new sub-community. And I think there was so much of that element certainly in 2016. You could argue it was the even bigger bet, but there was a lot of that element in this cycle as well, much more explicitly and overtly and in the public for everyone to see.
Yeah, there's a really interesting one thing that the mainstream. I've never heard a single mainstream commentator even engage with this question, much less think about it seriously. Is like Donald Trump as like the high variance candidate, which is you might accept. Say you could accept all of the many plausible criticisms of Trump, of a future Trump administration, and you still might say we are in a high risk environment. We are continuing down the path we are currently going down will lead to disaster, right? We're in a entropy increasing situation. Entropy is increasing in our institutions, in our national debt, in American society. You can prove this with all kinds of things. And you can say, I have two candidates. I have the low variance candidate, Harris, Biden, keep the ship running, competent meritocrats in every position, policy positions that are natural extensions of existing ideas. Then I have the high variance candidate, where we're absolutely rolling the roulette wheel for every single position. Which one do you choose? Even with just that description, even acknowledging as a venture capitalist would that 90% of the time those roulette wheel you're gonna lose those bets. You still might choose the high variance candidate. You know, in 2016, Michael Anton wrote the kind of 93 essay.
Yes,
and I kind of
I was going to quote that too. Yeah,
we need maybe an update for 2024, which is the roulette wheel presidency, the venture capital presidency.
Yeah. But you remember the quote in the essay of a Hillary Clinton presidency is Russian roulette with an AK-47. At least with Trump, you get to spin the barrel.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think this concept of political variance is quite underrated. And it's been interesting to see for each of these appointments that Trump has made, the only kind of position you that's publicly made is like pointing to their quite legitimate foibles. And no one sees the kind of obvious method in the madness, which is we need to break out of the situation. The only one that I've seen like that, and it's the Washington Post inexplicably ran an op-ed by Kevin Roberts, the president of Heritage Foundation, where he says at the end, basically, like, these appointments they're not designed to fix things. They're designed to break what needs breaking. I think, like, yes, that is the method here. And maybe they won't work, but you have to engage the argument.
Yeah. And their new editor, I think, is doing really important work. I forget his name, but
there's an interesting thing happening with LA Times, with Washington Post, where the reality is there's a little bit of what's the term? Market discipline being imposed on these newspapers.
Yeah.
And it's actually, I think it's very healthy for the newspapers and then also for America.
Sticking on the venture capital element, I think that there's a distortion between going back and reading Girard and reading especially contemporary commentary on Girard and how he is interpreted now. And you can attribute that to Peter. You can attribute that to some of the more modern kind of popularizers. The current version of Girard feels much more Nietzsche inflected, feels much more connected to. I think if you if you read an older version of Girard and you read some of the commentaries on Girard, the things that people kind of use Girard as a tool to argue for, it's very much a philosophy of preservation. It was the preservation of Christianity within academic context that was quite hostile to it. At the same time, it was a preservation of some of the more egalitarian norms of academia itself against a kind of increasingly rough and brash vanguard. That kind of Christian hospitality. I feel like very few academics would be willing to acknowledge that they were trying to preserve a Christian hospitality, but that's what it was. To, I think, a newer frame of Girard that accepts the hostility, accepts the norms of social media, accepts the kind of hostility and suspicion towards legacy institutions, but still embraces Girard as someone who almost embraces a revolutionary element. I think that in some ways, Girard is interpreted by Thiel falls so much more on the role of the outlier, on the role of the heretic. Whereas, certainly, I think Girard would not necessarily be approving of heretics per se.
It's interesting. I mean, there's so many different directions we could go here. I think read in his initial context, Girard is much more evolutionary than revolutionary. I think he's suspicious of
yes, exactly
revolution, both from a political sensibility, but also from the kind of within his theory, revolutions are almost always false revolutions. They're false attempts to break out of this sort of
they're fashion.
Yeah, exactly. They're kind of fashion. He's much more interested in culture, the very opposite end of the sort of spectrum. I think Girard, in the original context, is low agency, right? He thinks that a lot of the things that we set out to do are not driven by the will to power, not driven by individuals, but actually driven by these sort of deep currents. And in fact, he wants us to pay more attention to the sort of deep currents of history and less attention to fashion, as you might put it. The closer you are to power, the closer you are to technology, the closer you are to business, the closer you are to politics, the more suspicious he is of your own agency, right? He describes himself, he develops this concept based on a reading of Steinhold. That's right, Steinhold, the French, the Red and the Black, the notion of the political atheist. And he calls himself, I don't know if he wrote this, but in conversation, apparently, he called himself a political atheist. Somebody so what is a political atheist for Girard? It's someone who denies that politics matters, who doesn't believe in the power of politics to make change. So that's all in some ways, that's all quite opposed to the kind of contemporary use of Girard.
That's why you read Girard, you invest in Facebook, and then you donate to JD Vance.
And I think as Peter has his own kind of relationship to these things, although a lot of this is, I mean, the ironic thing, which is not lost on anybody who has been following this for a long time, including Peter, including others who are talking about this for a long time, is that there's this mimesis of like Gerard is fashionable, right?
Yes.
Which is really funny and ironic and was not really not true during his lifetime very much. And I think that does make difficult anyone dealing with Gerard today in an honest way. The rejoinder to that is to say that we've entered a kind of stagnation that requires this sort of Nietzschean Gerard or an individualist Gerard, Girardist method.
I think that this interpretive Gerard becomes more valid as you realize that we're going from a world where the Christian norms maybe were preserved in a secular way, maybe were preserved in a nominal Christian way. There was still some kind of cultural respect for Christianity, even if most people didn't go to church. To a world where that's just not the case, and where a world where the norms are not just indifferent but actively hostile to a kind of Christian grace. And Gerard becomes a philosopher who's very difficult to read within his own context when that's the case. It almost becomes, it becomes this thing that you read as a venture capitalist, or maybe you read as a political Christian, and as something that signifies very different things.
The thing that's lost to some extent is one way of reading Girard is the scapegoating process. Because Girard is quite interested in the long history of this. This is one that's often lost on people. Is that this Girardian scapegoating is not only a kind of human constant; it's also an historical process that unfolds over thousands of years. He calls it the process of harmonization. And one of the results is the resulting of the kind of foundation of human culture upon religion. And Girard's theory of Christianity is that Christianity breaks this. It creates a ratchet that steadily demythologizes and destroys culture. And now, in some ways, he was like in the Owl of Minerva Flies at Dusk. He was living at the end point of that process. And he saw himself as living at the end point of that process. And I think now, as we live in a truly secular society, secular, not in the sense people do or don't believe in God, but that people don't believe in myth. People do not carry around with them the cultural context of rich symbols built up over thousands of years. The question is, it becomes, where do we go from here? And I think that, as a response to that question, that's where that kind of Nietzsche and Girard becomes more interesting.
Now I have to ask, where do we go from here?
Yeah, that is.
And more specifically, where does the Christian norm, or just the norm in general, the secular norm, where does that go from here?
I think it's an interesting question whether we can survive secularism. I mean that in the literal sense of the human species.
The real X-risks are the atheists.
Yes.
Yes.
Many people are saying. No, we were talking a little bit before about how, the vast majority of dystopian works, one of my great professors, Professor Olga Mirsin, Russianist, pointed out to me when we were reading Zamyatin's book Мы, which is a precursor to, seen as a precursor to 1984, but it itself is a response to an H.G. Wells utopia. Every dystopia is an inverted utopia. It's a utopia with a crack or a flaw in it. But all these dystopias, 1984, Huxley's Brave New World, Margaret Atwood's Handmaid's Tale, they are all like the Soylent Green movie and other pieces of that era. They're all responses to social and civilizational fears that were very much au courant at the time they were being written about.
Yes, real and timely fears of social engineering.
Yeah.
Wonder where those went.
But one work stands out as being anti-mimetic in this, and being opposed to the social fears that were au courant. And that's P.D. James, British novelist P.D. James's book, The Children of Men, written at a time when everyone, the Paul Ehrlich, Club of Rome, overpopulation, these is very, very popular. She writes of a world in which no one is able to have children anymore. And so truly a prophetic work, and a work that the British government is trying to hyperstition into reality every day, it seems. It seems clear now, it seems obvious to anyone who's really looking at it, that the question of how do we reproduce ourselves, and what is a world in which the human species gets back to the business of making itself look like, is the political question of the 21st century.
Yes,
Um,
and there's something fascinating here where let's go a bit more into the actual plot of Children of Men. I think a lot of
Amazing.
people
Yep.
who have heard of the book, they know the premise. What if people just can't have children? But they don't know like the actual premise of they don't know anything
Mm.
past the cover, which is Britain descends into, and they're imagining that Britain is still a very important global power. Very funny joke. But they're imagining that Britain is a very powerful, it's still a global power, and the way it preserves its power and legitimacy is essentially by returning to a kind of monarchy. But it's a kind of bureaucratic monarchy. They have this guy who's essentially dictator. I forget what the exact role is. But he's basically the dictator of Britain. And the way that social order gets preserved in a world where no one has anything to look out for is that you just make them fear the Leviathan more. No one's invested in the future. No one has anything at stake. No one is naturally incentivized to solve the collective action problem. And the solution is just that you whip them harder. And that's a bit prescient, isn't it?
Oh yeah, it's in the book. The British government puts the managed in managed decline, right? The idea is Europe has fallen to disorder and chaos, and Britain's going to be different. It's going to have order until the very end. Stiff upper lip. There are all these boat people and refugees coming over that they have to manage. They put them in camps, and that becomes a plot point. They focus on keeping public order, even though sort of low grade terrorism of a kind of indeterminate character. They're focusing on preserving the culture, and there's some other pressure. They have this sort of euthanasia. They call it the quietus, or of managing resources by getting old people to off themselves. And then the culture describes they're the youngest people, the people that sort of last generation born, are all messed up, psychological just fragments. People become very invested in dolls and carting around their pets in like strollers and things, and treating them as if they were their own children. Again, this is written way before the rise of the dog mom. The premise of the book is, this is a spoiler alert, that, and it's revealed slowly, but that a woman, I think who's actually a refugee, becomes pregnant, and no one. It's presented as a mystery. It's never resolved how is this possible, and the mission of the book and the mission of the protagonist is simply to keep this woman alive and deliver her to a kind of resistance movement off of the operating with on the seas, as it were. So underlying the question of natality and what constitutes natality and what constitutes hope is, I think, the question of the book. And there is a sense in the book that the loss of hope precedes the loss of natality, which I think is very prescient. And the book, it's a P.D. James was herself a quite devout Anglican. The title "Children of Men" is an allusion to the Psalms. There is a quite a kind of biblical. The woman is very obviously a Marian figure in the book. It is a kind of Christian warning about what a post-Christian society looks like. That again, I think is very prescient.
Yes, there's something, there's a lot that's interesting, that's fascinating there. The thing that I can't get out of my head is the child is like a revolutionary movement, right? There are these kind of terrorists, like unironic insurrectionists, and they really want this child. They have hope. They have hope for kind of political revolution. So they have the hope for they're like a terrorist cell before they get the child. But then then there's this pregnant woman, and they really want to get the pregnant woman as a symbol for their revolutionary movement that predated the pregnant woman. There's something very interesting there that I think has real world parallels.
Yeah, no, I think this notion that this regime ultimately is premised on a kind of managed decline. And if you can simply prove that that decline is not inevitable, that the regime will actually collapse. I think there's something real deep there.
Yeah. That seems like something relatable almost. I'm a Zoomer. That feels a little relatable. It feels the world is premised on managed decline. And yeah, is there an alternative? I guess we'll never know. We'll have to. Is there a pregnant? Is there one? Can we find one innocent?
Yeah.
Can we find one innocent one?
Yeah.
Oh my goodness. But we're in the circumstance where I think that is the narrative. Secular stagnation. It is just inevitable that developed countries have low growth rates. It is just inevitable that China will catch up, that they'll be able to generate synergies, they'll be able to leverage lower wages, they'll be able to they'll be able to catch up in terms of technology instead of innovating, imitate instead of innovate. And that entire narrative of decline and kind of reversion to the mean is a sort of managed decline narrative.
100%.
I think the thing that's on the tip of my tongue that I'm hesitant to say is one version of this narrative is just look at Silicon Valley, look at the AI boom. We're bringing back productivity growth. We're increasing total factor productivity, and so we're gonna get back to 4 or 5% GDP growth soon. And that, on one hand, that seems very important, and it's probably good for us to talk about that more. On the other hand, there are social trends, spiritual trends that probably continue to decline or maybe decline even faster that are, if anything, more akin to the problem in children of men, including literally the fertility rate. Does the AI boom, does getting back to 4% GDP growth, if that happens, does that reverse the fertility decline? You could argue that, if anything, it increases the fertility decline.
Absolutely. And this is, I think it's really worth taking a kind of very hard, very steely-eyed look at the actual evidence we have in the fertility decline. And I think the one thing
Yes.
that people who study the issue very seriously have very different ideas of what to do about it. The one thing everyone agrees on is that the number one driver of it is opportunity cost. And as the society gets richer, opportunity costs change. Tyler Cowen the other day pointed out that people are walking 15% faster now than they did 50 years ago, whatever. And his comment on this was, this makes total sense because opportunity costs have increased. The opportunity cost of taking a leisurely stroll is higher than it was 50 years ago. The opportunity cost of having children is much higher than it was 20, 40, 50 years ago. And the richer you get, the more the opportunity costs increase. We would actually
Yes, there are two tricks to get closer to the world of children of men. It is be rich and be in a state of peace. Don't fight. There are two easy tricks to increase fertility. Be poor and start a war.
Yeah. There's a lot of truth to that. So yeah, as we become richer, as we become more peaceful, then fertility is massively declining. And that suggests that there's a kind of trap here. I mean, I do worry that there is a kind of one danger of a certain kind of techno-optimism is that it believes that the technological solutions can substitute for spiritual problems. And I just don't see any evidence of that. I think that in many cases, a kind of spiritual renewal can go hand in hand with an optimism which lends itself to building great technology. But I don't think you can substitute one for the other.
Here's one challenge. Here's one narrative that people might pose. With the growth, with the destruction of the old order, the political order becomes in question as well. With the destruction of the old economic order, the political order, the order of almost philosophy, of academia, of truth production that manufactured a lot of this, many would argue, manufactured a lot of the decline in fertility. That order is getting blown up too. Do you think there's any credibility to that?
I don't think we should presume. Don't count your chickens before they hatch is wise advice. The last 10 years have seen the growth from really the extreme margins of Western political life to much closer to the center, opposing this question of can we survive these institutions? And in the United States, other places, maybe we're electing political leaders who promise to engage that fight. But we really, with maybe the exception of Hungary and El Salvador, and I think put a big asterisk in those as quite distinct situations, and maybe Israel. Actually, I would not include Israel on this. We do not have a model of actually successfully shaping a new political order with moving past these institutions.
Yes, the thing that I think conservatives should just be terrified, shaking in their boots from is, we drain the swamp, we, stop politicizing the DOJ, we, deregulate, we cut $2 trillion in spending, we get to 4% GDP growth, we're building AI, we're beating China, America's number one again, we're winning on trade, we're bringing the jobs back, and the birth rate just keeps falling, just doesn't stop. And maybe there's a tiny bump, but it's canceling out like the last 5 minutes of decline. All of the shift in political order, all of the things that I think many people are genuinely, there's good reason to be excited about for just doing them for their own sake, that all of that turns out to just not really matter at all for fertility.
I think there's something very plausible there. And in addition, we also are not we're not really at the politically costly pain box part of the reform process yet, right? There's still a lot of optimism. Look, all my best wishes to the Doge and people who are working on it, but I'm sorry, there just simply are not $2 trillion worth of weird NIH sex studies and zoology experiments to cut, right? You can cut all the wacky stuff that's going to do 1 to 5% of the cut you're looking for.
Yes.
And then you're looking at real trade-offs, political trade-offs, right? Politically costly trade-offs. And
you're looking at entitlements, you're looking at military spending, things that have political constituencies and allegiances and commitments that President Trump made, or President-elect Trump, that Vice President-elect JD made. We're not cutting Social Security, we're not cutting Medicare.
Yeah,
and yeah, I agree. It's harder than it looks, but I'm worried that even if it's not harder than it looks, that it still doesn't get there on the spiritual and on the fertility.
Yep, I think that's right. I think that's real. Part of the question then becomes how do you use political power to actually address the real underlying issues? And I'm worried that we're quite distracted from that question.
I would say that the question that precedes that, the question posed by Gerard, and that I think he's taken a strong stance on, is can you even do that? Is there such a thing as political power for spiritual good? There are there's more Christian nationalism drama, apparently. I'm not that informed about this. Are you informed about this?
I'm more informed I'm not very informed. I'm still more informed than I want to be about it.
Okay, we'll put that to a side, but let's actually address the underlying philosophical question here, because I think it's very important. Is there such a thing as using political power to advance spiritual ends?
I definitely think there is. And I think it comes from shifting power from institutions that are ultimately unhygienic or deleterious to a robust human future, and towards institutions that are more supportive of it. But I think, again, you have to be very clear-eyed about the political trade-offs and political will and capital required to make those changes. So, for example, I don't agree with her and everything, but my colleague Catherine Pacolic has said, look, low fertility ultimately is a demand-side story, not a supply-side story. It's about how much do people want kids. People who are more religious want kids more. People who are more involved in religious communities and institutions are more religious. Therefore, you could imagine a world in which, I think Catherine would like a world in which many of the things that are now government programs, ranging from Social Security to public schooling, just simply go away. And then the alternatives left behind are the older original alternatives, which are usually religious communities. I think that will lead people to, and there's some interesting evidence for this. For example, I think there was a study out of like Ireland or whatever that showed where certain social welfare programs moved from being run through churches to being run by the government, that fertility declined. I think there's a very plausible story there. Now, here's the deeper question is there anything like the political will to make that happen? I don't think so. And so that's where we have to, even before we get to that world of kind of terraforming the institutions, so to speak, we have to address them. You have to be convinced that you actually need to do this. And I don't think we're not nearly there yet.
Yeah, there's the question of, is there political Christianity, and then is there political anti-Christianity? And the second one thing is, it seems, I think many of the people, even those opposed to Christian nationalism, would say, yes, there is such a thing as political anti-Christianity. But is there such a thing as political Christianity? Maybe harder to say. Even if it's just repealing the political anti-Christianity. This gets back to Gerard, right? Gerard sees, this is actually quite difficult. I think he's a bit ambiguous on this question to me, where he sees both a declinist threat and a revolutionary threat.
Yeah.
Both a revolution and two revolutionary threats, both revolutionary socialism and revolutionary fascism. And to me, this is a great mystery. This is something that is left unresolved by I See Satan Fall Like Lightning, where I think is where he addresses it most explicitly, but also in his later work, I just don't really see an answer. Do you have an answer?
Does Gerard have an answer? No, this is
Of-
one of the weaknesses of the closest thing he comes to an answer is his notion of kind of conversion, by which he doesn't necessarily mean a like religious conversion, but a kind of conversion of the heart, a kind of interiorization of the problem of violence.
And
It's
that's
much of
not
an
a
answer, though.
religious conversion.
Not necessarily a religious conversion. Yeah, I think his
Okay.
example he uses is of the poet Holderlin, who sort of retreats to his tower to just contemplate and write poetry. Yeah, but that doesn't seem. Certainly, Girard does. Again, he explicitly disclaims that there are political answers to this issue. The closest thing I think he comes to say is to look at the spread of a certain kind of conversion. And there have been a number of moments in Western history and American history where there have been mass movements of the heart, as it were. You
Many
can look
Great
at the many,
Awakenings.
yeah, exactly, including the 1960s. I think our Great Awakening. There was literally religious revival in the 1960s and 70s,
Yes.
but also in a broader sense, a kind of Great Awakening.
Civil rights, political terrorism.
That's right. Yeah. If anything, it's funny. People are talking about the 2016, 2020 as a kind of Great Awakening. But I actually think it wasn't really. It's a kind of false Great Awakening.
Yeah, we had 1 year of political violence, and it was like
pretty minimal.
And I don't support it. I don't think any amount of political violence is bad. But you compare that to a random year in the 60s. There wasn't that much political violence on a historical scale. And
No,
yeah,
that's right.
it is this thing where conservatives made it a huge deal. And to the extent that it's an interruption of current peace norms, of current norms around there, not being political violence, it's a big deal. But just on an absolute scale, it feels like there's an exaggeration.
Yeah, I think it's a kind of, and I think one of the things that's quite deadly is the politics of simulation. We had a simulation of a Great Awakening, right? One thing that drove this home to me was visiting Harvard shortly after some of the big kind of campus protests, and I was talking to some folks who had been there, and they took me to the part of campus that had the encampment. That's like literal rinky-dinky park, not really in the center of campus, not really that disruptive of anything. And it was blown up by both the kind of would-be erstwhile revolutionaries and their opponents as like this massive deal, but it was actually a sideshow. And no comparison at all to the massive sit-ins of the 60s and 70s in American colleges.
Yes, and bombings and kidnapping. Yeah, that's right. Actual terrorist stuff. I don't endorse setting things on fire. Did anyone die at Harvard?
It's like that quote from the Big Lebowski about the German nihilists. Say what you will about the National Socialism, at least it's an ethos, right? Say what you will about the Weathermen, but at least they were like very serious about achieving revolutionary political change, as opposed to the kind of simulated Great Awakening where it's if you don't get pizza delivered, you start complaining about your ill treatment at the hands of the.
That's it. I'm voting against Biden.
That's right. Yeah,
doing it for Gaza.
That's right.
But yeah, there's something so remarkable about biographies of revolutionaries, and it could be the Weather Underground, it could be Jim Jones, even it could be Mein Kampf. There's this stewing that happened where you're trapped in your own world, you're trapped in your own special kind of theory hell, and you just stay there for 20 years, and you stew and you hate the world, and that's what makes you a political revolutionary. That's what makes Jim Jones, that's what makes even Hitler, and that just doesn't happen. I don't know.
Right. I think you're right about that.
Is there like a single person? Do liberals believe that like Donald Trump spent like decades like stewing and developing a political ideology? Do people think that about like Biden or Kamala or Obama? No. Maybe like the closest, as I was saying this, the closest you can think of is maybe like Steve Bannon.
Yeah.
He was off on his Navy service reading Evola or something.
Yeah, and then it's post 2008. Yeah, he's the closest we have to like a real revolutionary figure. But yeah, on the left, it's really and again, one has to wonder how much of this is owing to it being a kind of simulation of a political revolutionary moment as opposed to the real thing. people are performing it online, but how deeply are they embracing it? How deeply are they feeling it? I guess there were a couple of like people setting themselves on fire. That's pretty serious.
Yeah.
That's the closest we've gotten, though. And even then, what's striking about it is how performative it is. It's always a performative kind of thing.
So I remember two cases.
Yep.
One guy who did it for Gaza,
Yes.
and one guy who did it to protest Peter Thiel's secret conspiracy to destroy Silicon Valley Bank.
I'm telling you, man. I will say,
do you want to explain this? I feel like we should explain this for the audience. The second one, I think they know about Gaza. I think they know what's happening in Gaza. But the other one.
Oh, I don't know if I'm familiar with that particular conspiracy theory.
There was this bank in Silicon Valley, and many of these smaller banks, these regional banks, they're not under as many kind of legal protections, both for better or for worse. And one of those banks under exceptionally few legal protections was this bank called Silicon Valley Bank. And as the name suggests, it was in Silicon Valley. It was lending to all of these Silicon Valley startups. And all of a sudden, it had a liquidity problem. It just couldn't make withdrawals. And all sorts of these people were trying to make withdrawals, people whose payroll depended on it. They were trying all sorts of crazy asset swaps and other things with the bank to try to get their money out. It was a classic bank run. And I don't think that I read the manifesto a long time ago. I don't really believe it. I think it's kind of silly. Obviously, the author really believed in it, really believed there was this conspiracy led by Peter Thiel to take down Silicon Valley Bank and to either take down his competitors or profit off of the bank run or something. I don't really remember. But it was this really niche thing. It was not a thing of you look at the Weather Underground. You even look at like Bannon. They have a deep philosophy. They have roots. It's very interesting. As much as Marxists are cast as modern Marxists, at least, are cast as globalists or like anywheres, they have like particular sentimental attachments. At least the ones that I read about in the history books. And this is like all people who are like still alive. This is all the Silicon Valley Bank conspiracy. These are all things that happened last year or a year before the manifesto. I think it might have been 2 years ago now. So modern, it's so in the present. It just does not feel revolutionary. I'm sorry. Like I know he like burned himself, and that's like quite tragic. And I'm sure he believed in this, but there's something in the revolutionary character that it feels cheap.
It is very performative, and it's also very tied to particular kind of reality communities. Renee DeRessa and I wrote a piece for Foreign Policy making the case that like this is a new kind of espionage vector, looking at all these instances of people leaking classified information basically as for the lulz, right? Or to win points with folks in their online communities.
Talk about the Pentagon leaker for a second. I don't know.
So there's this big leak of Ukraine documents and people looking for like a motive. And the guy's motive basically seems to be winning arguments on this like Discord group he was a part of. And also impressing people like what a big shot he was on this sort of Discord group. And that really was his primary motive. And there have been a number of other instances of this, like there's a simulation game called War Thunder.
Yes.
That has a permanent warning on the user forum saying don't leak classified information on here, please, because there have been at least 2 or 3 instances of people leaking classified information to win arguments about various weapon systems in this game. And I think we're gonna have more and more examples of this. But this thing, the Gaza guy setting himself on fire, they suggest the kind of performativity of these kinds of movements that lack, as you put it, deep roots and the kinds of kind of isolation that over a long span of time can actually instigate an actual revolutionary political movement.
But I don't think revolutionary political movements are like isolated. They're a community. You look at the 60s, they have a commune, they're all reading like Marx, they have both depth and breadth to their movement. It's a real, and once again, I'm not saying it's a good thing, but it was a community. You were part of the communist community. You were part of the revolutionary communist polycule network community. Okay? That was a real thing. That was a real place. You would go to Berkeley, California. It was like a geographic center. You would go to, and like the Silicon, or not so the university campus was like a real place. You had real revolutionaries. You that hired like literal terrorists,
Yep.
like convicted terrorists as tenured professors, and it was, but once again, I can't say this enough, it was something with depth and breadth. It was something that traced their lineage back to Marx, to Hegel, to Rousseau. And there's like a meme version of this, which is like the James Lindsay thing of, oh, is Nicole Hannah-Jones secretly a neo-Marxist? And maybe there's some kind of validity there. She just does not seem like a deep thinker. She just does not seem like a Stokely Carmichael, right?
Mm-hmm.
Maybe you go back a few generations, Lenin would not see Stokely Carmichael as a deep thinker either.
No, yeah.
So degradation, and these are people who are responsible for grave human death, who are like some of the wrongest people in the world. But there was a real revolutionary depth there, and I'm very fascinated by the online community stuff on the reaction on the simulacra, but I really can't get this out of my mind of this revolutionary personage like just vanishing. And this to me, I mean, once again, I'm not endorsing any of these people's actions. I'm very anti-communist. I've never been a member of the Communist Party USA. But there's something about revolutionary fervor, I think, that like, I'll put it this way. The amount of revolutionary fervor in a society, if it's too high, it's unstable, it's destructive, it's bad, it will cause death and terrorism. You don't want it to be too high, but if it's too low, I think you get many of the problems that you have now.
Yeah, there's a lot of truth to that. Peter Thiel has joked that, not really joking, our problem is that our society is not mimetic enough. There isn't enough of the kind of
it's mimetic
agonism.
Downward, not upward.
That's right, yeah. There isn't enough of the kind of agonism that actually drives depth over time. What I meant when I said they were isolated was not that they were isolated from each other or whatever, but that they formed. There's an old Oscar Wilde once joked that he couldn't be a socialist because he couldn't be a socialist because it took too many evenings. What he meant by that was, it was at the time, if you were a socialist, that was your whole identity, and you literally spent, it was like a cult. Like you spent all your free time hanging out with a socialist, reading the latest tracks, arguing about it or whatever, and that was what became your whole thing. And that with maybe a few exceptions we could talk about, that seems to be, that kind of fervor seems distinctly missing from our political moment. Although, as you were talking, Brian, about depth, commitment, geographical locus, etc., I did have the wonder whether are the effective altruists.
Yeah, you want to talk about the Berkeley radicals?
You might know more about the Berkeley radicals than I do, but that is a movement that does have a lineage that perhaps could qualify for actually being a...
Yeah, they're the new Berkeley radicals. That's what I'm saying. They're in Berkeley. They're in the same place. They're on the campus.
There's a long tradition.
They're literally co-located with the terrorists.
They have the polycule thing down. They have their like esoteric theory debates. Yeah.
Do you want to explain this to the audience?
Oh my gosh. Where do we even where does one even begin?
Yeah, maybe with the depth and breadth. I'm not sure if I agree with you on this, but I want to hear more about the depth and breadth of the effective altruists.
I was talking to somebody the other day about who just didn't
like
really
cite Parfit.
No, not just this money more than Parfit. The effective altruist movement, there's a couple of interesting kind of currents that come together in the modern effective altruist movement. One of them is kind of applied utilitarianism, which seems to come out of folks more on the Boston side of things, who are reading Toby Ord, who are reading Parfit, who are reading Peter Singer, and find this sort of model of utilitarian philosophy, consequentialism, very persuadable, or very persuading, and actually try to begin to live it out. It's like the moniker effective altruism comes from trying to operationalize Peter Singer and Derek Parfit, right? And there's a long history there of this sort of Benthamite utilitarianism.
Yes.
And you could draw a direct lineage from Bentham and James Mill to Sam Bankman-Fried. In some ways, Sam Bankman-Fried is like the Quetzalcoatl Haderach of this utilitarian, this centuries-long breeding program to produce the Sam Bankman-Fried, the completely...
Parents are what? MIT professors? Berkeley?
No, Stanford.
Okay, Stanford professors. Okay, my bad.
Who, he's raised inculcated in kind of consequentialism. He really seems to have the kind of risk. His notion of risk is purely mathematical. He has no internal state of the kind of ideal moral actor in the kind of Singerian world is somebody who has no ego, is a truly egoless actor who only acts for the kind of the greatest good of the greatest number. Like, this is the guy. We've made the guy.
Yes,
And then
but
there's
with a
also
very important exception, and I think that this kind of goes back to his entire ethos and the entire ethos of the kind of post Sam Bankman-Fried reaction in EA as well, is that I think that there is a very modern approach to risk and to hypothetical utility
yes,
that is very different, that would have seemed like blasphemous to Bentham or really anyone before modern financial instruments, basically.
So you have this.
I think this is so important, where I think there's so much emphasis on reality and on how the way reality unfolds as an unpredictable thing. As there's kind of two types of risk. You could say that there's the risk of the wine glass in The Princess Bride. You have two glasses of wine, or at least this is the premise.
Yep.
The premise is that you have two glasses of wine. One of them's poison. You pick one of the wine glasses at random, and then you drink it, and the other person drinks the other glass. And the thing is, no matter like how much you spin it around in your head, the reality is one of the wine glasses is poisoned or the other, right? And no matter how many kind of post hoc justifications you have, you die or you don't. And of course, in The Princess Bride, the twist is that the guy setting up the game has poisoned both the glasses and is himself immune. But there's this other kind of randomness that's a coin flip that hasn't happened yet. It could go either way. And so much of the approach of the effective altruists, and I think their persistent freedom from reality, is denying risks of the first type and presenting all risks as risks of the second type. Everything that rises up and disproves their predictions are, I was just unlucky. My controller was just off. And it is something that I think is very modern, and not a way that someone in the 16th century, was it 17th century, was conceiving of risk.
Yeah, you have the invention of risk in the 16th, 17th centuries, basically. In the 18th centuries, when you have late 18th. But what you have, so you have the split. Like any good orthodoxy will have splits and sects and heretics, and you have this big split over what's called long-termism, which is a question of kind of how much discounting of the future do you do, and then there's this merger. This is something I don't understand that myself, where this sort of nascent rationalist EA movement takes up a set of risks articulated by the extropians, articulated by San Francisco, Berkeley transhumanists in the 90s, and then goes and kind of runs with that. That movement seems very situated in California originally. But again, I don't fully know the story of how those set of risks became central to long-term SDA.
Yeah, Bostrom was at Oxford, so
Right.
I think there was always
But he's
some
on the
kind of
listserv, right? He's on the extropians listserv.
Yeah,
he's part of
he's
these
influenced
conversations.
by this and the exact genealogy. We need someone to do like James Lindsay, but for the rationalists and the effective altruists. Yeah, I don't know.
You're giving James Lindsay too much credit here. James, the problem with James, he does this sort of intellectual history as conspiracy theory.
Yeah, no, but that's the entertaining version. That's the version I want.
That is a fun.
No, I am like saying I want the meme version of it. I want the content version of it. I think that would be, if someone wants to do like genuine intellectual genealogy of it, that would be very well respected. It would be a contribution to the base of our knowledge. But the meme version would be funnier.
Yeah,
the meme version would be better content.
That's really true.
So okay. I've had this on like the to do on the queue for a while, and I know I'm going back in time here. But modern Girardians, and actually this connects to this approach to risk as well. But the modern Girardians stole Girard, interpret Girard in a very different way. Why hasn't there been like an academic defense or academic preservation of is Peter Thiel his only student? Like where are these other guys going?
No, I think Girard was Girard and the Girardians were already marginal to the academy, right?
Yes.
So it's funny, like Girard's a very central figure.
But he had his own kind of academic mystery cult, right?
Yeah. Let me. I mean, I think there's an argument to make any real philosopher. The mark of a real philosopher is that you have disciples and you make disciples. So Strauss had this, and
Yes.
Girard has this. The Straussians, for their part, for their own reasons, I think they were quite focused on the Academy as an institution. Girard was always the opposite. Obviously, it's funny because in some ways he should be a quite, for lack of a better word, mainstream figure. He's tenured at Stanford. Many people don't know this, but he actually organized the first conference of French philosophy in the United States. When you talk about like French critical theory coming to the United States, people like Derrida, Baudrillard, he actually organized when he was at Johns Hopkins University. He organized the conference that brought them here, and that led to it was like this like speciation event for French critical theory in the United States. But he himself that was never his sort of style, and the arguments he wanted to make were very interdisciplinary. They were very much if the arc of his academic specialty was literature, right?
Yes.
And the arc of literature, again, someone he anticipated this. It's towards critical theory. It's towards the kind of Cambrian explosion of symbolic of analysis of literature through the lens of power of different kinds. It becomes a kind of fashion, and he's always just more interested in kind of the deeper cultural questions. So he was always completely marginal from his own field. His work is quite interdisciplinary. The people that he worked with are quite interdisciplinary. A lot of folks who found themselves in philosophy departments in European universities, and so he never had any kind of real institutional hold within the academy. I don't know if he advised doctoral students, but I'm not really aware of very many who. There are not Girardians in the way that there are Straussians within the academy. And so this is one of the problems for Girard studies, is that it is quite marginal within the academy. And to the extent that it comes back, it's going to come back from people who are probably from political
Funded by Peter Thiel.
Who are funded by Peter Thiel,
Yeah.
who are
Ex-startup guys. Yeah. Who are good people, I should say.
Oh yeah, no, in some ways we are better off for having a focus on Girard that doesn't live within the academy. But yeah, there's no one who's like guarding the door in a way that most disciplines usually do.
Yeah. And I said right before this that this was related. And I think that it really is, because there's this kind of academic deadness, right? There's this kind of phase transition where philosophy is something you do in the walled gardens, that you have a functional gatekeeping structure. And in some ways, you had these two poles of the hardest sciences and like philosophy, maybe really not two separate poles, maybe more similar than different now that I think about it. But you had philosophy exit and go into the blogosphere, and you had at the same time physics and mathematics, less so mathematics, mostly physics and computer science, move and go on into Silicon Valley as we know it. And this is the birth of the rationalist movement. It is the birth of a lot of effective altruism, certainly, although that kind of goes back into academia for a little bit. But it's through these kind of online blogs, it's through these mailing lists, it's through the extropians and all of these semi-anonymous blogs on the internet. And that's just where things moved.
But I think part of it is about the kinds of arguments that are being made. The arguments within the EA community, within rationalism, you could distinguish between, there's a kind of strain of analytic philosophy that's still quite interested in the academic side, and there's still quite a bit of fluidity between people working in analytic philosophy and people who are part of the sort of rationalist community. There's another strain, the more kind of less strong Scott Alexander psychological strain, which has almost no academic credentials or presence. It doesn't seek that either. That's, I think, closer to the position of Girard. Girard's work does not address itself to a singular discipline, and that makes it hard for it to survive within the academy.
Yeah, this cross-disciplinary nature, although, yeah, it's interesting because I think that the silos are invalid, but I think that I think you go back, you read older philosophers, or you read older political theorists, you read older economists and even mathematicians. Even like you read modern mathematicians, actually, it's still this way, where there is a directness, there is a disambiguation that is much better it's just much more pleasant to me. I just like it more. What can I say? But no, there's something that I think I've really put my finger on just now, which is that it goes back once again to the freedom from reality thing, where
Mm.
if you have so much information at your fingertips, it just becomes a matter of storytelling. It just becomes a matter of invocation. It just becomes
Mm.
a matter of very surface level things, playing off of emotion and kind of just passing the story that many people want to tell and attaching as many tidbits as you can from it. It's a real sort of collage of things, and it's not, yeah, and it's just not rigorous. And it's just not only is it not rigorous in the philosophical sense or in the academic sense, but it's just not true. It's just a take.
It's just a take.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think we should stand up for the disciplines more. This would be one of my heretical takes. I think we're much too eager to rush towards interdisciplinarity, much too eager to condemn the siloing. That's
But
yes,
like,
right.
why is empirical econ and econ theory, like, why are those two things attached and econ theory isn't attached to political theory? The structure of the silos seems wrong. I think there should be silos.
Well, yeah, I think we can talk about structure. What I was going to say was that in any given discipline, you can only grapple with, there have to be some questions that are central questions people are converging on. There's a kind of Schelling point phenomenon here. And the reality, this is Silicon Valley loves Gerard because Silicon Valley loves the iconoclast, the innovator, this kind of Steve Jobs figure.
I thought they just
But
loved Peter Thiel.
they also love Peter Thiel, peace be upon him. But the problem from an academic standpoint, and this, everyone loves Thomas Kuhn, structural scientific revolutions, but nobody takes him seriously. Because what Kuhn implies is that, yes, you need the figure who can break out of and define the new paradigm, but then you need a lot of people to just follow up and do the grunt work, right? And most academics, most professors are smart. They're not brilliant. They're not iconoclastic. They're not seeing beyond the horizon. They're really good at filling in the details. And for a work of genius to be enduring, one of the things you need the people to come in and fill in all the gaps, right? And what a discipline does is it provides a kind of decentralized structure for managing this kind of intellectual work. And what happens when you don't have a discipline is there's nobody to come in and fill in the gaps, to extend the theory. And ultimately, then there's actually a way in which that inhibits innovation, because in order to have a paradigm redefinition, you need to have a paradigm in the first place. And if you never define a paradigm, then all you have are a series of kind of geniuses of indeterminate relationship to each other. There's a kind of Macintyrian point one can make here, right? Where before you had disciplines, it was like the world of philosophy in ancient Greece or Rome, where you have all these different sort of schools, none of which can really talk to each other, both of which have incommensurate measures of what they're trying to achieve. That mean you can't really make any kind of forward progress. So the part of the problem in academia today is not that we have disciplines, that we've chosen very bad Schelling points. We've chosen really dumb Schelling points that don't necessarily generate important responses to social questions. And part of the fault here is the kind of the merging of the research university with the state,
Yes.
which has led to completely stultifying, bureaucratically defined disciplinary programs. And one of the best things something that Doja could do would be to radically reorient or even disrupt or break this process.
Yes. Just as a political matter, not even as a matter of saving money.
Yeah, as a political matter, even as an intellectual matter.
Yes, exactly. I think the point that like NSF is actually not that much of the federal budget is true, but we should just do it anyway.
Yeah, the problem with NSF and NIH is not only that the money is trivial. What matters is actually the ways in which they reify bad Schelling points and bad disciplinary centers. And they worked when they worked. They worked because they were establishing disciplinary centers that were actually important for real social and political and cultural and economic problems.
Yes. But I'm also just so dissatisfied at the thing that replaced it. It's
true.
very funny because very recently I was, involved in this fight over this California AI law, and I landed on the same side as like Jan LeCun, Nancy Pelosi, eventually Gavin Newsom, and our tagline was like evidence-based AI policy. Just look at the evidence. These people, they're just saying things that aren't true. And in this kind of narrow fight, we won. Like, we stopped the law. I think we were really missing a kind of systematic critique. And that's a systematic critique that, like, people I'm not always on the side of. But I think that's a critique that the institutions have to be able to land against the internet at some point. And there's certainly a true version of this critique of, you're just making shit up. I think that's really what a lot of these effective altruists are, just making shit up. And a lot of the internet, really, as you say, it's a reality game. But there's no charismatic narrative around, you just can't make shit up anymore, especially when that charge, I think, has been used falsely for some time now. Experts say. And that's not quite the same thing, right? An expert saying that you just made shit up is not the same thing as actually proving that you made shit up. But there's something very distinct. There is a narrative that's yet to be cohered around, of, there's a specific way in which these internet grand narratives are put together that are just really distortionary. And I had a series on McLuhan that was about this. My thesis at the time, which I'm not sure is true, but my idea at the time is, oh, you're optimizing for not necessarily retweets, but quote tweets or like mentions in a blog. You want to take something that's really crazy and stupid, and then you want to present it in the most agreeable way possible. And that's what makes up the narrative structure. And the version of this that I think is really appealing is, you can see it. You can see it in like all of these articles and the way that they talk. It's a combination of millennial therapy speak and just the most deranged QAnon level conspiracy theorizing imaginable. It's a very strange fusion, but once you put your finger on it, you start to see it, right? That's the thing that I think is really appealing about this theory. The thing that I think is not that appealing about this theory is, like, it feels very temporal. It feels retroactive, applied to a specific part of the internet, because it is, and it feels less good at explaining other parts of the internet. It feels less good at explaining actual QAnon or other parts of the internet that are just like, yeah, that have these kind of different mechanisms. And maybe the reality game thing, maybe people just trying to score social points, that's another factor. But there's a kind of specificity to the narratives, and what is the meta of the reality game, what actually wins in the reality game. That seems like something that's really underexplored, and maybe that's provisional, maybe it's overfit, but it feels like something that people should actually do.
Well, I think there's a really interesting question of, what does an anti-memetic strategy look like? And one of the things you almost have to do to generate interest, which is to say to generate attention around any political thing you want to achieve, is, you have, as you put it, you have to present the sort of the James Lindsay version of it, not the Quentin Skinner version
exactly,
or something, right?
Yeah.
You have to. So what you find often are, I mean, I work in defense technology, so I see this all the time now, right? Are people creating what are basically reality-shaped conspiracy theories to explain what's going on and to popularize a theory of change. So you can be concrete, like the way that we talk about the problems of the prime contractors and the revolving door and defense procurement. There's real grains of truth to some of those questions. They don't really address the deeper structural issues. They don't really comprehend some of the underlying process or legal or regulatory problems. They create a kind of kabuki theater version of the problem to address, that people who frankly don't have the I think this is actually the biggest thing. Tyler Cowen once said that the very gnomic thing, let's see if we get this right, which is that context is that which is implicit. And I think I keep coming back to this. What makes a conversation rich is a shared context that allows many things to go unsaid. And that allows you to move past it. And it's science, when it's operating properly, has this sort of massive context that everyone is read into. That can create problems where there's context breaking or paradigm breaking situations. But it's also what enables a lot of the work to proceed. What's happening as we lose a shared culture is that we're losing the sort of shared context. So the only ideas that can succeed are the ideas that are relatively low context or not context dependent. So I think as we try to re-envision what does science look like in the 21st century, I think this again is one of the real challenges that we face. how do you pull people back away from a kind of low context environment like the internet? How do you pull them back to disciplinary conversations that create shared context and shared method, but around their kind of right problems? Because right now we have this. You saw this all over with COVID public health stuff, where you had the kind of expert class, high context, completely borked theory of the problem, completely tied into bad bureaucratic incentives. On the other side, you had a very low context, agile kind of insurgency that in many cases had the right intuitions about the problems, but then sometimes but had no way of imposing rigor on itself.
Yes.
That I think that is that is the meta problem for many of our issues, especially scientific issues, that I really think we need to be thinking about.
But are we actually worse at science? I think in some ways, maybe this is in reaction to COVID, but in some ways, scientific infrastructure has never been better.
I think that's true. I think that there's my sister is an immunologist and my great aunt was an immunologist. It's a remarkable thing, the differences between their work ways. My great aunt was at the era where you could do important scientific research by looking at cells under a microscope and using colored pencils to carefully to do where you do like spectromography and you record it with colored pencils. Like this is back in like the 40s and 50s. And then today my sister uses as like genome sequencing. So the quality and the kind of information and data we're able to gather have never been better. Our ability to share that data via the internet has never been better. My understanding is that in many cases, students are at least better trained about the data. I think they're not necessarily as well trained about method and thinking scientifically.
How IVF embryos are selected?
No, I know the theory. I don't know the practice.
No, there is no theory. You just eyeball it.
Oh
You
my
literally
gosh.
just eyeball it.
Amazing.
There are some startups that are providing an alternative to this, doing genetic testing, but that is by far the vast minority, like less than 1%. Of IVF parents. Usually the doctor eyeballs it and they have, I think, intuitions that are like good, better than random. But literally you just look at the embryos under a microscope. You just pick one that looks good.
Wow.
But to go to the underlying point about institutions and about this kind of legitimacy, I think we've yet to, in some ways, the entire project of academia is that you can have something matter without it going viral.
Hmm.
And to the extent that the virality dynamics in the outside world change, that shouldn't really change the feedback. Like maybe you can have like talent pressures, more people want to go to Silicon Valley, whatever, but that should not stop the people in academia of equivalent talent from doing the thing. But clearly the people within academia doing the thing have gotten worse at it in some very important ways. Certainly in medical, maybe not in machine learning, maybe not in computer science, but in medical, in physics, the string theorists are still at it, to some degree in chemistry as well. And then there is this alternative structure in Silicon Valley that is much more mimetic, that is much more based on getting things going viral and productizing them and getting investors and so on, which is actually much more successful than the original version. At least in the present, right? Like present day medtech startups, biotech startups are better than present day biotech academia. They might be worse than biotech academia in the past, but not in the present. And I feel like every theory of academic decline has to explain that.
I think part of it is the kind of the bite of Conway's law. Conway's law
Explain that for the audience.
Conway's law says that the communication structure of an organization will replicate the organization's own structure. In other words, if you have a quite centralized organizational hierarchy, you'll have a quite centralized information communication systems on top of it. But I think Conway's law is actually bidirectional. If you change the communication structure of something, you actually change how it operates. And think about the world of science until the internet. It was a world in which the kind of functional differentiation, different institutions in society doing different things. So thinking in the kind of domains of sports, entertainment, politics, business, etc. They had their own communications systems that were basically totally disconnected from each other. So if you were a scientist or say a biologist, you would read the New York Times or watch the evening news for the update from the world, the wider world. But you were not expecting to get any useful scientific information out of this. Instead, you were participating in conversations and communications via communications institutions designed for your discipline, academic journals,
Right.
conferences, maybe the occasional general science journal like Science or the New Scientist or whatever. The internet completely explodes this. And now those centralizing communication institutions are, in many cases, quite marginal to what's actually going on. And instead, what's important are sub networks or subparts of Twitter, of the internet, also of things like Web of Science and other tools to find useful information, but cliometrically and across the search with a kind of a broad search space across all of scientific publishing. In some cases, this has actually made conferences and in-person meetings more important because they're a way of signal cutting through noise. I don't know how to. So I think as peer review breaks down, as these communication structures break down, I think that's a part of the story as to why these disciplines are breaking down in some ways.
And the network beats the state, at least at biology. Yes.
Yeah, and the network beats the state, or the state as a metaphor for the kind of centralized discipline. One possible solution is to just build better networks. So I have a friend of mine, I don't think he's actually building this, he's a mathematician, but thinking about how could you rebuild peer review atop of in kind of the world of archive using blockchain or other technologies to actually handle
community notes for peer review.
What if you had a community? Like, why are we stuck with this one very broken approach to peer review? That's just one example, but we're still very early in this process.
Have you seen this meme I made where I edited the X on top of the archive?
No, I love that. I love that.
No, it's Elon. It's the natural next acquisition for Elon. You want to make it the everything app. It should be RX. Yeah,
I love that.
X rxchive.com, the everything app. Yes. There's some extent where there's a contradiction here where we need to reconstruct the academic discipline, we need to re-silo, but the ability to gather the talents, the resources to re-silo comes from essentially people who are very good at playing the network. So you have to be like very well connected. You have to be very good at making things go viral. So you're like natural anti-institutionalists. And those are the people who, if we're behaving for honor, at least from our perspective, for honor, for goodness, would recreate the silos. And I think there's a very obvious reason why these people would either not want to or not be good at it.
Well, at least maybe it depends on the discipline, but on the network side, the network that's winning is not only the communications network, it's also your network within bureaucratic science. I think it's, as there's more and more noise in publishing, the importance of kind of personal connections to funders and grant givers has become more and more important. One kind of shelling point for a lot of on the right now are basically rolling back the regulatory state. It's not so much, it's funny, like the kind of classical Republican take on this is basically like the state's too big. We need a smaller state.
Yes.
From a certain standpoint, like that's not really that important to the Trump coalition. Like I don't think the Trump coalition cares about government spending per se. I think what matters is that the state is doing bad things. And one of the things it's doing is inhibiting innovation. And so I think there's broad consensus around quite robust regulatory, not just regulatory reform. You think about changing the rules. There's also a sense of like destroying parts of the administrative state in order to get them to stop enforcing rules in certain ways, and actually like seeing like the bureaucrats as the enemy, so to speak. That's a shared belief across many parts of kind of the Trump coalition. I think where things become more interesting are when it comes to the question, what do you need the state to be able to actually do? And I think that's an area where there's not necessarily a lot of consensus.
Yeah, there's an attempt to pit Elon against Stephen Miller. It's hard to cut spending and promote and execute the mass deportations at the same time, even though Trump is nominally in favor of the mass deportations. And that gets to one of the tensions, right? It gets to the tensions of a kind of inherent libertarianism, an inherent globalism almost. You mentioned Balaji. He wants America to have just the best talent across the world. America is a sports team, not a family, to borrow a phrase from another important piece of tech right history, but maybe we can get to that afterwards. One question that people have is this sincere commitment to a kind of global meritocracy, or is this commitment sincere?
Which commitment?
The commitment to global meritocracy, to bringing the best people to America.
Man, this is an interesting. So yeah, there is a. I won't without exposing confidences and naming names. I do think there is an interesting question. So there's one kind of line, which is we need more high school immigration. We're not getting enough. We need to expand, move to points-based system, move to high school immigration. Among certain parts of I think it's probably the consensus position in Silicon Valley. There are some interesting folks in the tech who very quietly dissent from this. And the claim is basically like, if what you're looking for is not the top 5%, but the top 1 or top 0.1% of talent, then getting a visa is a skill issue. And if you can't make it through that hurdle, then are you really in the top 0.1%? Now, you can take this argument too far, certainly, but there is something to claim that your average H-1B is not a Google PM. They're like a software contractor making $75K a year or $100K a year. Is that really mission critical to this program to solve for the H-1B visa? Now, how much of this will be a fight in this administration, I'm not sure.
Yeah, and then there's... And there are these factions, I think, around... It's interesting because it almost matters more as a symbolic disagreement than as a real disagreement, I think. I think you're right in that there's factions within Silicon Valley that are skeptical of H-1B visas and so on. And at heart, there's this narrative of, oh, is America for Americans? Is America just for the people who are here right now? Is this kind of almost blood and soil? Not quite, but at least soil nationalism. Or is it something that is more meritocratic? You see these debates between Vivek Ramaswamy and J.D. Vance, for example. I think Vivek went on Ezra Klein's podcast saying exactly this. There's this idea of protectionist America, where immigration is a tool to raise wages competition from people who are willing to work, or America once again as this kind of like global sports team, right? And regardless of whether that question is settled in policy, that feels like a very important philosophical or sentimental disagreement within the American right.
I don't know that the America is a sports team people we really have that much of a leg to stand on, frankly. I think that among the kind of tech, sincere, unabashed patriotism is certainly very fashionable now, which is probably a good thing. But
they would argue that American patriotism, making America itself the greatest, is the American sports team.
I guess what I mean, fair enough. Well, I guess what I'm meaning to say, though, is that during the Cold War, for example, if you were a hardcore capitalist, then you wanted America to win because that was the leader of the free world, the capitalist world. There's a version of that now, which is if you want the world of the network state, then you should want to use, you should view a pro-technology, pro-innovation, pro-openness American state as the kind of, in some ways, it's like a version of socialism in one country. It's like innovation in one country. If you can't get an innovation agenda working in the United States, almost nothing else matters. If you lose the United States, I mean, this is, you can, I've been listening to a lot of Mark Andreessen's podcast recently. And this is the implicit criticism, or not criticism, the implicit theory on why Mark switched from being a Democrat to a Republican, which is that global innovation cannot survive an American regime hostile to it.
Yes, you cannot outrun the American regime. You can't outrun it to formerly apolitical areas.
Yeah, the
They will
idea that
become
like you're going to have
political.
Prospera in Honduras or like a random.
Oh,
It's
so
just going to
there's a
fail.
very interesting anecdote about this, which is that
Yep.
Prospera governance very recently, I think like last week, came here to Washington, D.C. to meet with senators and representatives
Yes.
and garner support. And I think that there's a very, oh, got 'em, they need to appeal to the authority of the American state version of this. But I think that there's actually a very optimistic vision here, which is that we'll get the freedom zones, we'll get them across the world under the umbrella of the American protectorate, and that this is actually a good thing. I like this. I think that America should stand for the American protectorate, should stand for freedom zones in other countries with American investors. And I think that partly out of necessity, but I think philosophically it behooves them as well, the freedom zones, to support America. I think this is a very good development. And I think this is like a bright future. If the bright future ahead is not total global dissolution, but instead like an American empire, but not an American empire that is spending all of its resources in this kind of self-destructive and ultimately suicidal way, but one that is pretty clear cut about metrics, about what it's willing and unwilling to protect. That seems pretty optimistic to me.
Yeah, exactly. So there's, I think, who was it? Someone recently posited, and Ross Douthat, I think, picked up on this, the distinction between nationalist libertarianism led by like Vivek Ramaswamy and more nationalist communitarianism, maybe with J.D. Vance as its champion. And right now it works because they have a common enemy.
Yes.
And politics is ultimately coalitional, and so your enemy is your friend. I think around questions of family policy, around questions of immigration and reshoring versus like onshoring versus reshoring, you might start to see some of these tensions pop up. And if and when we return to a situation where maybe there are particular technologies where the libertarianism leads one way and communitarianism leads to another, then this coalition might start to fracture. But I think right now the enemy is clear enough and powerful enough that there's plenty to do in this coalition.
Yeah. There's talk of the Democratic Party reforming, changing its philosophy, somewhat moderating, triangulating even, but it's not going away. They'll still get at least like 45% of the vote, probably a lot more. They only lost by what, 3%, 4% this year. They're not going away. So maybe there's no reason. Do you think there's a reason that these differences will ever actually have to be settled, or will the enemy just stay there forever?
No, I think there is I think when you have a realignment, what distinguishes it is not that one side wins permanently. It's that the other side has to become like the other, like the losing side has to become like the winning side in order to get back in the game. And I think that process is already underway in the Democratic Party. And the interesting question of what happens in 2028. I think if the Republicans win again, maybe with J.D. Vance running, then this realignment will absolutely become concretized. If the Democrats win in 2028, I think this is more of an open question. If the Democrats come to believe that they cannot win office as the party of rich, overeducated white people, then they're going to change. And I think the way that they change is by doubling down on kind of abundance agenda. It's time to build, and then saying, yes, we're going to build. We're going to be nice about it. We want to build housing too. We just want to have some more affordable housing. We want to build energy too. We just want more sustainable energy. And I think there's a kind of play to the nice middle there that adopts some of these criticisms. And then that's when the kind of the national libertarianism begins to fracture from the kind of national communitarianism. But we're still, I think that's the direction we're heading, but it's still a ways off.
I don't think the abundance agenda has a real political theory. This is a confrontation that I still remember, which is Ezra Klein's podcast again, arguably the leader of the abundance agenda,
At least on the
and
left, yeah.
Jim Pethokoukis, good friend, and I think on board with the abundance agenda from more of a right-wing or libertarian perspective. And Ezra asked Jim what the political coalition to defend a kind of optimistic, conservative, optimist abundance agenda would be. And he basically didn't have an answer. Ezra basically said, and this is pretty different, and I think it's pressing because he's trying to defend himself from many of these interests too. People naturally are afraid of change, are afraid of progress, hate business even when it's doing good things, and there are all of these special interests that want to carve into that. And that's why the abundance agenda lost in the past. And there's really no reason why it's not going to keep losing for exactly the same reason than it did in the last 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, so on.
I don't see it that way at all. I think, especially in the world after Loper Bright, the door is wide open. You were ready to bust down the door of these local interests. And what I think the right has going for it is an ethos, an ideology that justifies it. Right, the ideology of American renewal, of the fertility crisis, of fighting and beating China, and that's what the left lacks, frankly, is that as long as any kind of special marginalized interest can beat a national interest, then they'll keep losing. And so they'll keep losing for a little bit longer. That's not a problem on the right, I don't think.
Yeah, the abundance agenda on the right, like they were always more on the libertarian side.
Yeah.
That's more believable. The abundance on the agenda on the left, yeah, I just don't see the political theory for that.
Well, I think the political theory is if we don't do this, we will just keep losing. That's what happened
I
last
think
time
they
with the
should
New
just all be
Democrats.
conservatives. Ezra should be like a new neocon. He should just get mugged by reality already.
That's what happened with the New Democrats, right? If you go back and look at like Bill Clinton, circa 1992 or 1996, and he's basically almost an unreconstructed Reaganite in many of the things that he's calling for.
Yeah.
So this isn't the first or the last time we can expect this to happen in American politics.
Yeah, and that's actually inspirational because he had more overtly he had the Sister Souljah moment, but he also stood up to unions. He like genuinely cut bureaucracy. Clinton, not even. And you need. So there's this open question of, is the Democratic Party, are people in the Democratic Party in charge anymore? Is the Democratic presidential candidate, is a Democratic president actually in charge? And I think, yeah, if the answer to that is yes, the answer to that is like Bill Clinton or, I don't know, John Fetterman. No, you don't like John Fetterman?
No, I like Fetterman. Fetterman.
Or like John Fetterman or Gavin Newsom, Blue Caesar. If he's in charge, then yeah, maybe it happens. If the Democratic Party just continues being a machine, continues being this like hyper mimetic, non-agent, like individuals, non-agentic thing, then it just can't happen.
So yeah,
and I think the reason why I think the abundance movement is going to continue in the state unless it gets a kind of Clintonite champion who just takes charge is that they actually suck at the friend-enemy distinction. There are people who are obvious enemies who they should not let anywhere near them, who are unreconstructed versions of boomer environmentalists who hate progress, who are incredibly neurotic, react crazily whenever there is technological progress, and they just should not be anywhere near each other. And the lack of a friend-enemy distinction there, just like, it is nothing but a sign of disappointment. That being said, if Gavin comes in and does something, or if there's like a national review, like exercising the Birchers kind of thing, but in the opposite direction, then maybe I should keep my mind open to it. I should be willing to see good things happen. But let's see if it happens. I think it's unlikely.
We'll see. I mean, I think I would take the other side of that bet, just because I think again, it's just a matter of electability.
Oh, I think that the Democrats might moderate on many issues. I think that they might just become like a more protectionist. I think that they're more likely to choose democratic socialism than abundance. I think they will become more popularist.
Do you think that there's the pivot to China is possible? This is Balaji's been posting about this.
Pivot to China, or to become friends with China, not necessarily, but to become more nationalist, to become more immigration restrictionist. I think Kamala already becoming more immigration restrictionist, at least like verbally, backing off of the woke issues, being like anti-crime again, super predators, being willing to put people in jail, cleaning up the streets. And I should say many of these things are good things, and maybe embracing more redistributionism, higher taxes, more anti-billionaire populism. I think those things are a lot more likely. And some of those things are good, and some of those things are bad. And it all goes towards a more populist direction. And I don't think that really involves doing a lot of abundance things at all. I think that it involves doing a few good things that are about restoring order, and then unreconstructed socialism.
It's possible. But what ultimately becomes self-defeating about this, though, is the fertility problem, right? You can't do socialism with a declining population.
Yeah, yeah. First of all, there's a 50% chance Republicans will be in office when that crisis hits. You actually get the entitlements crisis. And so that's not necessarily something that Democrats will even like. I would argue that at least on a cultural level, they're more responsible for fertility decline than Republicans. But that doesn't necessarily mean they'll even pay the price for that.
No, that's true.
What is the causal mechanism here between? I don't think there's actually like a causal mechanism between like fertility collapse causing problems and Democrats becoming better on fertility. Maybe there's a question that like it just makes Republicans win more. Maybe that's the causal mechanism. But I don't think that's actually like an area where accountability exists at all on the political level.
Mechanism is actually is the population itself, right? Fertility rates are lower in Democratic areas and Republican areas currently, and if that trend continues, then already the census undercounted red states, and may or may not be a lawsuit about this. Now the question is that trend going to continue? And I'm not sure. It's not as if many of those red states necessarily they're stronger on. So I think we can disaggregate the abundance agenda a little bit on some of the basic questions around infrastructure and housing. I do think that cost alone is going to continue to depopulate blue states in ways that disadvantage national politics. And you see it with Gavin. Gavin Newsom, I take to be quite a progressive.
That's believable.
Person.
So the forcing function is like the census and population decline makes the electoral college map and like the electoral map in general harder for Democrats. The Democrats realize this and they decide to like embrace YIMBY so that their states grow and they get more electoral college votes. That's the theory of change.
Yeah, or at least that's like a forcing function.
Okay. Yeah. That's slow, but yeah, that's believable. Maybe not for 2028, but that's believable for.
Yeah, I think as a kind of long-term factor. The only way this doesn't take hold is if presumably Democrats in national government force anti-abundance policies on red states. But I think that's hard and getting harder. I think the appetite for robust federalism or even basic nullification is increasing. And I think any attempt by Washington to really do this kind of thing in the future. I think essentially the question of is state capacity increasing, or is the gap between states and the federal government on state capacity increasing or decreasing? And I think it's decreasing. I think the states, at least certain states, are getting more powerful.
Oh, absolutely.
More resources, more institutional competence relative to the federal government.
Yeah, and that's because they're in some ways network-run states. Florida already somewhat of a network state. We're starting
a network state. That's right.
Yeah, Montana already somewhat of a network state.
Yeah,
and you see this broader trend. There's strength in the network, and some states, just especially red states, just need to open the door, and they are willing to open the door. Yeah, so I'm like, just purely on a kind of pundit level, I'm optimistic about Republicans' future. I'm even optimistic about Democrats' future in terms of democratic socialism. Not necessarily that'll be good, but that they can win elections. I'm still not optimistic about the left-wing version of the abundance agenda. I just think that there's at least like maybe this is, okay, I have one singular argument against this thesis, which is the groups are becoming less invisible. You have this trend where, the most powerful things are invisible. At least people are talking about the groups. And to the extent that people are talking about the groups, that Matt Iglesias and that random Atlantic journalist and Ezra Klein and so on are talking about the groups, and those become more visible and things that our Democratic politicians are thinking about distancing themselves from, that becomes a constant media cycle, especially if it does that. That's optimistic. That's a real friend-enemy distinction. You know what would make me really optimistic? If Ezra Klein got on the stage and just cast out the AI doomers. We are just not having this here. You guys are crazy. You guys are going to recapitulate Greenpeace. It's the same thing as like Greenpeace protesting whenever the nuclear power plant goes up. You guys are no different. We've seen the story before, and we are just not having it this time. But the abundance movement, especially the left-wing version, actually, you have guys on the right-wing version of it, like Neil Chilson, who are willing to do this. But so few on the left-wing version are willing to do this. And I think some of it is because of funding, some of it is because of personal ties, but like just as in, there are movements that can fix those things. There are movements where if there are like funding ties that make things inconvenient, then there's a bottom up reaction to that and creates a kind of more, you can say more pure, but more politically strong version of the coalition. But that just has not happened, and it hasn't, like, the premonitions of that hasn't even happened. It just like doesn't exist.
We'll see. What you might be calling for is a new, doubtless very different Ezra Klein, right? Like the next generation.
We need
of...
like Jared, but like Jared Polis, that's not really like a doomer bill, but he signed a very bad AI bill. Yeah, but there needs to be like a Sister Soldier moment.
That's right.
There needs to be a Bill Clinton. Yeah,
but I think that's all eminently plausible. Bill Clinton in 1988 was like very barely on the. He was a fringe figure in Democratic politics, and he scratched out a primary victory in '92, and then he took over the party.
Yeah. Maybe the who's that Kentucky governor, and Andy Beshear. Maybe he can do that. Maybe. But once again, he's like a Democratic socialist.
Yeah, it might be a figure. So it could be two things. It could be a figure we haven't seen yet, or it could be a figure making a kind of hard pivot. Like maybe there's a world in which
Abundance Gavin.
No, or actually AOC. Maybe there's a world in which AOC says the Green New Deal is more important than woke politics.
Sure, maybe it'll be anti-woke, but I think but she's literally like does events, has endorsed all of these union groups, all of these like environmental groups. Like that was the story of the Squad, was even more, I think, than social justice groups, which like a lot of people associated with the mainstream already. It was these radical environmental groups. They're like allies with the worst people, and maybe they do that coup, they do that 180. But that's not the story of Bill Clinton. It's very hard for me to think of. Maybe LBJ was like that, where he was allied with a lot of segregationists and he just flipped the 180 on them. So maybe there's a precedent for this, but that's something he does after he gets in power, right? Okay, so here's what the story looks like. AOC runs on redoing democratic socialism. She wins in 2028 and just flips the table. She does the 180, she does the LBJ, locks out the Sunrise Movement, and just builds the solar panels.
She's a survivor. I don't think you should underestimate her.
Okay, so we're seeing AOC 2028. Is that what we're seeing? Okay. And we're seeing the hard pivot. AOC, Abundance OC 2028. That's what we're seeing.
It's possible. Anything's possible, man.
Yeah, and how does the right react to that? How would the right react to an abundance?
The right still is, in some ways, is still running on very tired 80s, like cultural Marxism. They took a lot of like literal 80s and 90s talking points and dusted them off and called them wokeness instead, and they're still running on them. So I think the right very much has not really adapted to post-Bernie democratic politics in a way, and I think that the right is setting itself up to be mugged by reality when this coalition that won handily in 2024 it's not cemented. It's not like a right-wing coalition, right? It's a lot of people who are very dissatisfied with the incumbents, very dissatisfied with...
And there's two elements there. Is it right-wing and is it a coalition?
I think it is it's a coalition in the technical sense of like people with their own particular communities and cares coming together to support a candidate. Is it right-wing? Not really. It's pretty anti-incumbent. It's populist, but the issues of greatest importance to it are not ones that I think are out of reach for Democrats going forward, if they're willing to make a few changes.
Yeah. What's that branch that gets torn off? Is it the libertarians, the abundance people? Is it the...
I think it's working class. I think it's working class.
Okay.
I think if you look at the question of could Democrats keep the kind of educated white voters and re-pull more working class voters, I think the answer is yes. There is a way to do that. If anything, so in some ways, the tail that has to wag the dog might be the kind of the media memeplex.
Yes.
If the media memeplex adopts the kind of abundance OC position, then the wine sipping, college educated white ladies will follow along.
Yeah, and then
can you imagine a world in which like the memeplex that lined up behind a certain vision of social justice was lining up behind the abundance agenda? I think that's like actually quite plausible in a way. This is the thing that the right, I think, is in denial about.
I think it's much easier to imagine if you imagine like the 2024 memeplex rather than the 2020 memeplex.
Yes, that's right.
I don't think you can get them to care as much as they did in 2020 about basically anything other than racial issues. Maybe like actual socialism. But I don't think you can get them to care that much and cancel their colleagues and report on their coworkers and disconnect their family over transmission line reform. That's just not happening.
No, but I think
The 2024 version, like the Kamlamentum version, but for Abundance OC, I can see that happening.
I think you do it as a Green New Deal and you sell it as a justice. And then you can even pull some greatest hits. Fossil fuels companies don't want us building solar panels.
Yeah. And you do a kind of populist version of the Green New Deal. You have to, can you even call it the Green New Deal, though? Because that's associated with all sorts of academic and radical
I don't know that.
groups.
I don't know if that phrase has the negative connotations for most people that it does among the right, like a certain part of the
Maybe.
right. Yeah.
Even the abundance people even like because some of the center left abundance people will deride the AOC crowd, but they're also not really a political constituency, like in terms of votes. Yeah, I could see it happen. And then how does the right react to that? How does the right try to defend their gains?
I think the right's going to be very strong on cultural issues going forward.
Yes. So does Abundance OC run on also locking down the border, or at least like the Kamala thing of this is a problem, we should gravely consider it as a problem and balance it with human rights?
I think there's a lot of ways in which essentially to think about, like, why did George W. Bush run on compassionate conservatism? And it was because conservatism had been memed as uncompassionate very heavily and successfully for the last 8 years. So the classic move, the Bill Clinton move, is to basically say, I'm going to do all the right-wing things, but I'm going to be nicer about it. I'm going to be more equitable. I'm going to be less racist. I'm going to be less, it's not going to be all bootstraps. We're going to take care of the poor, the marginalized, etc. But otherwise, I'm basically going to do what Reagan did. So you can imagine a version of this on the left, which says, yes, we're gonna have a strong, secure border, but we're going to be nice. We're not going to put the kids in cages. We're going to have a kind of amnesty. In some ways, this is the David Shore popularist thing.
Oh, I was imagining you going in the other direction of, yeah, we're going to have an amnesty, but we'll be very sure to deport and arrest and jail the criminals.
That's what Hillary Clinton was running on in 2008. 2008, there's some amazing footage of her basically saying exactly that. We're going to deport all the criminals, but we're also going to have an amnesty. You have to pay a big fine because you broke the rules. Yeah, so I can see a version of this coming back in a big way. People don't appreciate there's all kinds of interesting bibliometric evidence you can give for how quick and how radical the kind of left-wing turn in Democratic politics was. I think it was quite driven by very temporary dynamics in the media complex, in the kind of post-Obama Democratic coalition, in the kind of the structure of left-wing philanthropy. And I think we're going to experience a very hard reversion from that.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. I think the left-wing superstructure is very, very fickle in ways that are still not really appreciated, especially not by the right. I think they see it as a permanent thing, partly because the right also has no historical memory. The right doesn't really remember, like, Bill Clinton. Even, like, people who literally remember Bill Clinton don't really... They're all onto their new talking points now, not naming anyone in specific. But they're all focused on the new thing now. They're all focused on wokeness. They're all focused on, in some ways, like, older talking points, but they're not noticing the change in the game. And yeah, I do agree. I do agree people are likely to be surprised by the degree to which Democrats pivot. I just, once again, don't think it's going to be abundance. It's more likely to be the opposite, in my opinion. But there's really something that you said there, which is like getting back to fertility, right? Getting back to these kind of permanent problems of fertility and to some degree entitlements and of the kind of social and religious order almost that, yeah, maybe it's a forcing function for YIMBY and for kind of interstate migration, but I really still don't see a forcing function for Democrats to care about fertility. And some people say housing prices matter. It gets back to what we were saying at the very beginning of the podcast, where you have YIMBY Caesar come in, you have Jared Polis set national housing policy, you steamroll the local governments, and like fertility increases by 0.01.
Yes.
Does that problem ever? Are we just on the downward decline forever?
This is what we're going to be. No, something has to give.
Why? Why can't we just be on the downward decline forever? Why can't we just be on the fertility?
Do you want the real reason?
Forever?
The real reason is that the division of labor that permits a complex civilization depends on a certain market size and a certain population size.
Yes.
And that at some point you will hit a limit where you don't have enough differentiation or demand. One of two things will happen. Either you will outlaw birth control for the purpose of of a kind of desperate measure to reboot fertility, or if even if you don't do that, at some point you will no longer to pharmacologically make modern birth controls because your civilization has collapsed to such an extent. And that, I mean, we're talking about like Canonical for Leibowitz style, like post Roman Empire levels of collapse there.
Yes.
So something will restart the cycle of history, as it were. But to get there, a lot of really bad things happen, and we want to try to avoid that.
Okay, so the forcing function is the collapse of civilization.
Yes.
Got it.
Yeah, that's
looking
right.
forward to it. Looking forward to it. I think that. Yeah, I agree.
Apocalypse.
I think I did say I was looking forward to it, but I would rather not have the collapse of Western civilization.
Let's try to avoid that.
Maybe let's talk about the forcing functions before we get to the collapse of Western civilization. What are those? What are the?
Well, I think this is the position we're in now, and we want to talk about battling to the end. And maybe this is a good place to kind of pivot to it.
Yes, Battling the End, the Gerard Benoit Chantre book.
That's right.
Yes.
This is one of his last books. Right now, there's a kind of the question is how do you respond to this kind of crisis of civilization? There's one route which is basically managed decline, and then there's things that require more radical action. The danger of the managed decline route is it promises stability, a stability that it cannot deliver, and so you end up leaning harder and harder into the decline part of managed decline in order to, as a kind of search for a stability that will never arrive. And the forcing function is that these kinds of civilizations are basically committing suicide. And so you have to find a way back towards, or in a kind of Spenglerian sense, be replaced by civilizations that still have a spark of vitality in them.
But that's still just civilizational collapse, right? That's not going sooner. That's just restating that civilization will collapse.
The question is, can you find as a civilization, can you find your way back to natality, back to hopefulness?
Yes.
And it may be possible. In the West, we did have a baby boom, and the baby boom is a really interesting, and it was huge. It was going from 2.1 up to almost 4 TFR.
Yeah, and then there was a thing that we did before the baby boom.
Right, World War II, right? Yes. Like, that was interesting. Right?
We fought a war.
But the war, this is what's not appreciated. The war, the baby boom doesn't really start during the war. It's not as if we're fighting a war and people are like having kids in order as their patriotic duty. Even places like the Soviet Union, where you might have, or even Nazi Germany. Nazi Germany didn't have a baby boom during the war. Think about that. You have a society that has all the sort of ideological infrastructure to draft natality as a tool of the state, and it doesn't work. The baby boom is after the war.
Yeah, the narrative goes, it's hard to conceive while you're in the trenches. You come back from the trenches, and that's when the baby boom happens.
Sure. But I think what is going on when you're back from the trenches is simply, I don't think it's just merely the physical proximity of men and women. I think it's also a kind of a spiritual turn.
Yes.
Which is to say, you're literally turning from death to life. You've seen a lot of death, and now you want life, and you embrace life. And there's also some interesting things around opportunity cost there. One of the if you look at our best studies of the baby, econometric studies of the baby boom, one of the interesting things you'll find is that lower opportunity costs for women to leave the workforce were associated with higher fertility.
Yes.
So in areas where there was already basically where there was already a strong female labor force that became oversaturated when men returned from the battlefield, those are the areas where more young women chose to not enter the labor force. What we do with that knowledge, that's a bigger question, but it does come down to opportunity cost, and it comes down to how much do you desire kids. And this is what I think Hannah's Children, the book my colleague Catherine McCulloch is very good at.
That gets us to our first possible solution. Do we need war?
No, I think war as such is a kind of false answer, because you can fight hopeless wars. Like, I don't think if we just got into war with China, that would solve the fertility crisis.
Okay, good to hear.
I think that You have to have an answer to the question of what are we fighting for? And just to the extent that war causes you to answer that question, then maybe that contributes. But I don't think merely the kind of state of war forces you to move in that way.
Is there a country that we could start a war with that would answer that question? If we fought
gosh.
Iran, if we had a land invasion of Iran, we were going after the terrorists and the terrorist sponsors. We were fighting a war, Christianity against Islam. What's the TFR look like after we do the war with Iran?
I think it has to be a war that is in some sense existential for the United States. There's interesting evidence of this here, which is that we haven't seen a baby boom in Russia yet, but I predict that there will be a baby boom in Russia.
Okay.
And it does have to do with the war. If you look at Levada Center surveys for satisfaction of life in Russia, they have never been higher in the history of Levada Center surveys, which is remarkable, right? Because the quality of living, while it's still very high, is certainly been stressed by the war. Yeah, I haven't seen any good studies indicating why this is, but to me, it makes total sense. Which is that people there's a purpose to it's forced by a kind of brutal dictatorship, and I'm not justifying Russia's crimes in the Ukraine war, but there is a sense of the whole society is moving in a direction, and a direction in which any individual can find a kind of meaning and a purpose. I think that will some of that could anyways continue after the war. I think part of the challenge of the United States is, in the age of nuclear warfare, it's harder to actually fight existential wars, which again is a good thing in most ways, but I do think is a hindrance to this kind of feeling of social unity.
Yeah. So you need an existential threat.
Israel's another good example.
I think it has to be, but it can't just be any existential threat. There was a book about this on the Spanish flu, which depressed fertility.
Interesting.
And it's hard to the way they did it was the flu was more prevalent in different states, I believe, and that's how they measured it. So they just disconnected it from the effects of the First World War. But yeah, there are certain. It's interesting because it does get to a kind of philosophy of spiritual significance and existential threats. Because there are some threats that don't work, and then like war, existential war. I think the examples that we have, they definitely work. Maybe there's an element of Plato thing. Plato says you actually shouldn't do this, but like the society oriented towards war, right? Yeah, I don't really know. Maybe this is a good time to bring up battling to the end. I don't know. Do you have any more takes on what kind of existential threat we need?
Maybe it doesn't have to be. Maybe it has to be a national mission more than an existential threat. Maybe there's a world in which the real value of kind of the going to Mars is not whatever we do in Mars, but the kind of shared vision of a possible future that it could evoke.
There a fertility increase after the moon landing?
I don't know. That might be hard to disentangle from broader. What's interesting, right, is right after the moon landing, you have Apollo 13. We shut down the program almost immediately afterwards, and then you're in the 70s, which saw a massive decline in fertility in the 1970s.
Yes.
But it's coming. It's not. It's after the space race, we've given up on the space race in many ways at that point. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm not getting any definitive answers. Okay, Perplexity says there is no evidence to suggest this.
But I think that the actual landing was the end of the space race in some way. It's not the beginning of a bigger mission.
Was there a fertility increase during the Apollo missions? Okay, during the Apollo missions. Still no information.
Yeah,
but there is something about feeling an existential. Yeah. It can't just be anything. There are like. I feel like almost existential threats. It's like the Spengler thing where every age has its own atheist. There are like natural like inversions of existential threats. There are like the existential threats that make you communist, and then the existential threats that make you like libertarian. And I feel like you need the existential threats that make you libertarian. I guess war doesn't make you that libertarian either.
Well, libertarian maybe is the wrong word. I think
I was thinking of the Cold War. That kind of made you more libertarian.
I think you have to have a national mission that you want to participate in, and where you're optimistic for the future. Or optimistic isn't the right word. We're hopeful for the future. I think so I can't confirm this, but the baby bump after the First World War, if there was one, was certainly a lot smaller than the second one. I think it's because at the First World War, for a number of reasons, um, ended on a note of bitterness. There's a cultural malaise that takes place after the end of the first, because out of the shattering of the illusions of progress of the First World War. Whereas the Second World War, around the globe, even though it was hugely destructive, ends up being experienced as a kind of affirmation of life in a way that had a deep cultural impact, and also led to a religious revival in the United States and in England and other countries as well.
Yeah. And the reason why we can't have this kind of mission-driven war, we're a mission-focused company, we're running a mission-driven war,
Yep.
unlike all these dumb wars. JD Vance gets in charge, or Pete Hegseth gets in charge.
Gosh.
We're a mission-focused company, we're a mission-focused government, we run mission-focused wars.
Oh my gosh.
But the reason why we can't have that, according to Rene Girard and von Clausewitz, is... Do you want to explain this to us, battling to the end?
I mean, this is completely what he's talking about battling to the end.
Yeah.
Is the demise of war as an institution, as a replacement by technological competition and the kind of technologization of war. The theme of battling to the end is the completion of this process of the destruction of scapegoating that begins, Girard says, with Christianity.
Yes, this is the hat on top of the kind of Girardian telling of history, or of capital H history.
That's right, yeah. And the end result is that take the case of war, what makes war noble is that you believe that there is something meaningfully achieved by the destruction of your enemy. After Christianity, the feeling grows and grows that your enemy is also a kind of victim. That you don't believe in the implacability or the despicability of your enemy in the way you actually see them as a human being, and that doesn't mean you stop fighting them, but it means that you don't find anything noble. It becomes an act of your killing to achieve an important political objective, but you're not finding any special inspiring nobility in war.
Yeah, you could think of there as being like a higher and lower justification of war, and only the lower one remains.
Exactly. And so ultimately, this reduces war from the kind of the duel to being this kind of exercise in the management of violence. It becomes a managerial thing. And Girard is writing a little bit before this becomes dominant, but if he'd written the Battle at the End 5 years later, he would have talked about the drone as the kind of perfect example of this, where you just have this sort of technical apparatus of precise killing that achieves military objectives. There's no sense of a human activity. There's no, if the image of sort of Saint Michael destroying Satan is the kind of, obviously it's a very Christian image, but in some ways it's also a very pagan image. It preserves this element of overcoming evil. And this, over time, Girard actually in Balance the End writes about these sort of pagan vestiges that live on within Christianity for 1,000 years. And he highlights, as an example of this, he highlights Pope John Paul II's, actually before Pope John, I think Paul VI, and then continuing into John Paul II, the total change in the treatment of the Jews by the Catholic Church as an example of this, where for thousands of years, there was a kind of semi-official anti-Semitism, which saw the Jews as a kind of as murderers of Christ or whatever. And then this is officially rejected after World War II. And Girard says this is world historical significance, because it's the kind of final purgation of this sort of scapegoat idea within Christianity. And Girard sees this process as playing out in warfare, also in commerce, also in culture, to the end. But remember, for Girard, there's a paradox here, which is the scapegoat is the thing that ends violence, right? Because the many can, or war of all against one. Everyone comes together to blame
Leviathan
the scapegoat.
or Behemoth, yes.
Yes, everyone comes together to blame the scapegoat. Society's problems, you kill the scapegoat, then maybe you deify the scapegoat, and then there's a period of social unity. If the scapegoat process is broken, then there's nothing to stop. All you have is tit-for-tat violence. You don't have anything that can stop the cycle of violence. And so this, for Girard, leads to the apocalypse, leads to the widespread outbreaking of global violence, which he sees the global war on terror as a kind of, which is a war that's fought everywhere and nowhere. It's, on the one side, it's atomized violence out of nowhere. On the other side, it's this managerial approach to the management of violence. He sees that as a kind of prefiguring of this broader apocalypse.
Yeah, there's a lot there. I want to start with the Steel Man, the point that I agree. I think that there is a kind of mimesis between justifications between how you see the combatants on the other side if we're comparing like Joe Biden and Jackson Hinkle. They both fundamentally have a Western morality. They have a kind of secularized Christian morality. If we trust Joe Biden, he is a very faithful Catholic. And yeah, there's an element of the kind of international human rights establishment that's standing up for Ukraine and standing up for Gaza and standing up for the victim. There I see it. And this is part of the Girardian history, capital H history, the Girardian prophecy that sees essentially a global homogenization, of how we fight war and what we fight war for, right?
Yes.
And I think that if you're looking at the UN or if you're looking at Jackson Hinkle, there's a lot to that. If you're looking at Putin and Alexander Dugin and how they're thinking about war, to me there is less to that. To me, I think Dugin draws the friend-enemy distinction. I think Dugin sees the West as, he says, what is it, the Great Reset versus the Great Awakening, right? That's the book. And yeah, maybe this makes me agree with your prediction that there's a belief in this existential war and this kind of national mission. So that's how they conceptualize it. And then one more thing is just how they engage war, because I think how they engage war is both Western powers, Russia, China, and enemies of the West, global war on terror. It's all very asymmetric. You look at it, Israeli wars, which is not quite a great power war, but a proxy war between America and Iran. It's so asymmetric. It's so kind of data-driven. It's so targeted. The strategies are just completely different. You have Mossad blowing up these people's beepers as well as beepers. It's so asymmetric, and people are gaming out what does a Chinese siege of Taiwan look like. It's also heavily asymmetric. Chinese defense production versus American defense production and execution. It all feels so different. We're letting 1,000 poisonous flowers bloom.
So I think there's an interesting question of, and this is my friend Wayne has made this criticism of, is Girard just too Eurocentric? Do any of these dynamics apply to China or India? I think that's an interesting question. With the Russian case, Dugin's view of the war in Ukraine is explicitly apocalyptic. He sees this as a battle between Christ and Antichrist, where Antichrist, with the kind of Atlanticist forces, and he reads this in Carl Schmitt, which is there's something to this. He has an explicitly apocalyptic take on this, as it were. The question: what happens if Russia loses? What happens to this take? That's an interesting question. On the question of China, in Battle to the End, Girard fingers China as a future enemy of the United States at a time when that was very unfashionable to do. But he saw in our trade patterns that there was this kind of mimetic entanglement. So you have all these situations where you have apparent mimesis that dissolves into apparent difference that actually. So for Girard, actually, this is very important about Battle to the End. The source of the apocalypse is that we have a theory that violence comes from difference, but actually violence comes from sameness, and that's the danger. So take the Ukraine war, Russia's theory and America's theory is that Russia is different. It's this autocratic power. Russia's theory is that America is different. It's this sort of satanic power, as Putin has called it. Each will imitate the other by virtue of their mimetic fixation on the supposed otherness of the other. There's a version of this, by the way, very much the case in Israel and Palestine as well. In case of trade, the thesis of comparative advantage in trade is that two trading partners want different things. And that's what makes trade possible, is I want your widgets more than you have apples, I have oranges, I want your apples, you want my oranges, let's trade. And yet, Girard believes that this entanglement of relationship will lead to mimetic entanglement. You will increasingly want the same things. And that leads to the breakdown of trade if you both want the same things, and to competition. So trade is supposed to foster cooperation. He thinks it ultimately actually fosters competition. So, And in each of these cases, there's no longer any mechanism there's no longer any pressure release valve. So I do think you said Battling is Girard's worst book. I don't think it's his worst book. I think there is a lot that's left unsaid or unargued in the book. I think one of the real questions is what leads to you have these rivalries, U.S. Russia, U.S. China. What is going to resolve them? He never explicitly says it. But I do think it's interesting in a heretical take, the common sense take today, right, is that we're entering an era of multipolarity. And yet I don't think it's that hard to tell a story in which the U.S. vanquishes Russia and China. Those regimes each have deep weaknesses. And so I don't think we're that far off from a world in which these final rivalries, which for Girard, by the way, these are the final rivalries in history, in big age history. If you go from a world of dozens of rivalrous European states in the 18th century to a handful of smaller great powers in the 19th century, to really 4 or 5 great empires at the beginning of the 20th century, to 2 major rivals in the Cold War, then you end up with this unipolar moment where you have an asymmetric rivalry. It's possible to imagine a world in which even those asymmetric rivalries cease to function. That's the world in which Girard is imagining and battling to the end.
Yeah, I think that, and this is more coming from Clausewitz than Girard, but I think Girard agrees with it. I'll have to reread it, where he says increasingly the powers are prosecuting the war in the same way. I think there was some kind of temporary logic behind that, of the Soviets trying to get the bomb after the US got the bomb. Von Clausewitz had this logic of militaries becoming ever more similar, ever more managed violence. Yeah, that part I still disagree on. I think just as a machine that does things in the world, the Russian military, Ukrainian military, American military, Chinese military are just different things. They do different things. They have different strengths. They are capable of things that the others are not capable of. Maybe they're all capable of the nuclear bomb. And maybe there's this cataclonic logic, the restraining logic that Peter Thiel speaks about, of why we don't use the nuclear bombs, and so the differences are stressed. But I do think the way that warfare, maybe the kind of synthesis here is that warfare became most similar during the Cold War, and then went back down on the declining slope. There's a question of the origin of violence here, this very important question of do we fight because we're different, or do we fight because we're similar? And then the third thing is the question of trade. Does trade make us want the same things? So there are 3 questions to be litigated there. I think the first question, I think just in practice, as a machine that does things, in terms of how we practice war, it's very different, and it's very divergent, and if anything, it's getting more divergent. The second question of I don't know, tribal violence, let's say, it's one of these things where it's just hard to tell. There's a causal story that you could attribute to both. And part of that is the brilliance of Girard, right? Where there's this kind of inflection in every single place you look, and I guess he attributes it to the Christian inflection as well. Of, are people fighting over this land because they think it should be ruled differently, because it belongs to different people, or because they are both in desiring of that land? They both want the same thing, which is the land. And the question is whether you put the primacy on the values, or on what people do with the land, or even just their traits in general. One people and their customs, another people and their customs, or whether you put the primacy on just wanting the resource. But that part, I think, is at least plausible. Then there's the question of, there's this whole question of homogenization. You do all of this trade. What is it for? What is the end result of this homogenization? On one hand, there's this similarity where you go to a Chinese shopping mall. It's like an American shopping mall, but it's more American than American shopping mall. You ever been to these East Asian shopping malls? They're all more American than American shopping malls.
Yeah, I've been in the Middle East, and you have that feeling exactly.
Yeah, you go to the UAE, you go to Dubai, You go to a Dubai shopping mall. It's more of a shopping mall. It's more American than American shopping mall.
Look, so the problem for Girard is
right.
to complete the circle here. The problem is the Tower of Babel. So if the source of violence is difference, then when we are all united in the same city and tower, then we'll be part of the Brotherhood of Man, and there'll be nothing to fight about. For Girard, that is the world that is coming into being, right? The world of a global communication system, of a global financial system, overseen by a singular military power, basically, which also, by the way, doesn't have a military power that takes this sort of technical management of violence approach. The world of Larry Summers is like Chimerica. Doesn't mean that U.S. vanquishes China. Maybe China and the U.S. just agree. If the problem is difference, then this is a utopia. If the problem is sameness, then this is laying the groundwork for this sort of mass outbreak of violence.
Yes.
Where we all want the same thing. We can't satisfy it. We can't unify around a scapegoat. And there's nothing to stop the sort of paroxysm of violence. And again, Girard sees terrorism as an example of this, sort of what this looks like. The theory of the case in the early global war on terror was that terrorists were people from disadvantaged backgrounds who had been on the wrong side of globalization or whatever. That turned out to be completely false. Your average terrorist, particularly the really serious ones, is educated from the upper middle class of their society. In some cases, better integrated into globalization than the sort of impoverished people in their home. They're in the same country. So yeah, this is there's a kind of empirical question here. Is the Tower of Babel, is it a utopia or a dystopia? And Girard thinks it's actually a dystopia.
Yeah.
And that's what the book is about.
I stumbled upon something, and I think it's part of why I disagree with the Girardian history, is that I actually just think some people are just evil. I don't think it's systemic. I think systemic analysis, it has its place, but it's just so overrated now. And actually, like, people are different, and some people are just evil. And I think that gets to, certainly, I think that's true of many terrorists. I think there's just a lust for violence that is just not comparable to normal people. Like, this is just not relatable. It's not relatable to me. I don't think it's relatable to most Americans. Most Americans can't really empathize with flying a plane into the World Trade Center. Yeah, and I do think we are at kind of peak. This goes back to social media. It goes back to the kind of splitting. You've read this article, but this article is probably not out for the public by the time we release this. Let me just summarize this for the public. But look at the story of Rawls, who was this like incredibly big shot philosopher, arguably the most important philosopher of. He didn't do all his work in the second half of the 20th century, but of the second half of the 20th century. And he had this idea of the veil of ignorance. You could just put a veil behind all of society, and from your perspective, you could just indwell into any person in all of society, and you would care for the poorest, and you would just make the decision as if you were them. And Rawls, I think, has been an enemy of the right for a very long time. But I think we're rapidly approaching a time where that kind of logic, that logic of naive empathy, of just empathizing with the terrorist, empathizing with the criminal, just doesn't work anymore. And the reason for that is because when you grow up in the age of television, that is what you do every night, is you put yourself in Rawls' original position. Rawls' original position is actually when you lie down on your couch in front of the TV. That's Rawls' original position. You turn on the TV. It's this very clean screen. It's maybe a big box TV, but that box TV is the veil of ignorance. And you have a highly produced show designed to draw you into the perspective of the protagonist. You're indwelling in the veil of ignorance every time you turn on the TV. Now, what are you doing when you turn on your cell phone, when you log on to x.com, the everything app? You read someone's tweet, you're not them. You have your account, you can in fact reply to them, you're a different person. And in fact, what actually turns out, what people are really drawn to are positions that are just wild to them, that they cannot understand, and that Girard would predict this, that they can scapegoat around, that their people similar to them will scapegoat the people who are different in a way. And you can argue, is that because they're the same or because they're different? I think empirically, there is a great difference between the people who are piling on to a certain person and that person themselves. And you get rid of this entire substructure that was underlaying the entire Western project of administration, which was broadcast TV. And it's just gone. and you're not indwelling anymore. You're not sitting in front of the veil of ignorance every night. It's just gone. It's just done. And I think that's part of why I have just always had no fondness for Rawls. I've
Hmm.
always thought this kind of denial of human difference was just nuts, because I see it. You both see it in your ordinary life. And I think if you log off the TV, you go back enough in history, every civilization believed in human types and human classes and so on. But you had to be sitting in front of the TV. You had to be sitting in front of the veil of ignorance screen in order to believe in Rawls. And we're just done with that. We're just done with and that has a fundamentally, it draws you towards systematic explanations, because if you're just the same, if you're just the same as the guy flying a plane, if you're just the same as Bin Laden and his letter to America, if you could have been the
Hmm.
one writing that letter, then yeah, you're really drawn to systemic explanations. But I think that's just done. And I almost don't really feel like,
I think that's precisely setting up the scenario in which Gerard is writing about. Because what is it really being replaced by? It's being replaced by a technology that emphasizes difference,
yes,
but that cannot generate the era of television is a kind of era of like the simulation of unity.
yes.
This is like something I'm thinking about a lot. Like,
You watch the late night show, you download the
yeah,
update.
yeah, exactly.
The water cooler conversation
Yeah,
is the batch test that tests if you got the update.
exactly. And so you have the simulation of unity, and a unity that of the kind that a simulation of the kind of unity that might follow the killing of the scapegoat. But that's now gone. But what hasn't replaced it is anything to generate unity again. I think it was really that drove this home to me was in the days and weeks after the October 7th attacks in Israel last year. There was this explosion of violence on social media of folks from Israel and Jews and their friends posting images of the killing of Jews, folks on the kind of Hamasnik types, either posting the killing of Jews and it's a good thing, or posting about all the children being killed by Israeli
The
warplanes.
idea,
And
yeah,
and what emerged was this immense explosion of desire towards violence, with nothing to even begin the process of slowing it down. And I think that when Gerard envisions the apocalypse, this is what he has in mind. Of imagine that on a global scale, involving every kind of population, every kind of, and what would stop it? The only thing that could stop it would be a global police power, a power to actually just throw sand in the works of the machine. And Gerard talks a little bit about that too. But this is very much, I see Satan fall like lightning. Gerard challenges us to reapproach the gospel narrative without through its anthropological truth in Battle to the End and some of his other works. He wants us to approach the Christian apocalypse narrative again through an anthropological lens. And so I don't know. I really interested in your take on Rawls, and I think it's right, but I don't think it ends where you want it to end. I think we are at the cusp of being able to imagine this kind of globalized violence in a way that was simply. It's interesting. Have you seen the movie The Kingsman or Kingsman?
yeah,
Spoiler alert, not really much of a spoiler. The kind of evil supervillain plot of that movie imagines a world in which people set a signal through their cell phone that drives them into a murderous rage and gets them to kill everyone around them. That's something very deeply true about that. But it's not a neurological signal, it's an imagery signal. The vision of the apocalypse in the medieval period was of just people going insane with violence. And there were these paroxysms of violence, like peasant uprisings, which had this kind of apocalyptic character. And we've never seen one on a global scale before. But Girard worries that we have the conditions for such a outbreak of violence.
I think there's a lot there to take seriously.
Yeah.
I think the connectivity, the trade, the fragility of both, actually less so of the communications, but more so of the material networks. That's very important. And that I think is something that Peter takes very seriously, that underlies a lot of kind of anti-libertarian restrictionism. I think that there is something there that I think at an anthropological level people see, that the trade routes either make it so that you have no war or that war is 10 times worse, 100 times worse than it should be, or that it would be otherwise without the trade. There's a part there that I'm not sure if we actually disagree with it, but maybe we both disagree with Gerard on it, which is if you're trying to anthropologize the Christian apocalypse, you should start with the premise, which comes from the Christian apocalypse, that the Christian apocalypse is good. That this is in fact something that to be celebrated.
Well, this is an interesting point, and maybe this is a point we can leave off on, because it's the least satisfying part of Battling to the End, and his other works where Girard deals with this, which is like, what do we do about this? And Girard basically says the meaning of the apocalypse is conversion, or you convert or you die. Either we find a way to give up violence, or we kill each other. And in the era of nuclear weapons and autonomous weapons, very plausible. I think the limit of this anthropological approach is that question of kind of what follows from this. In the Christian tradition, you have an event called the Parousia, or the Second Coming of Christ. I don't know how to present an anthropological take on this notion of Parousia. And frankly, Girard didn't know either because he punted on the question. I don't, if you view this as an anthropological interpretation, I don't know. I think there is something terrifying about the apocalypse if you don't have a kind of fideistic commitment or deep faith commitment to the overall story. It's not clear why this would be good news unless you had a kind of voice from the outside.
Yeah, you believe
they believe in the good news.
Yeah.
That's right. I don't think there's a way around that. And I think that Girard's attempts to construct that have basically failed. I think what we're talking about today, something Peter Thiel's been talking a lot about recently, I think it's the weakest part of his message on this is that he just wants to find another way to delay this confrontation. And it's not quite in sync with, I think, the Christian approach to it.
Yeah, there's something very interesting there because Peter Thiel emphasizes the role of the catechon and the Antichrist, right? The Antichrist,
Yes.
Satan imitating Christ, presenting a kind of facially Christian version, but in service of violence and in service of destruction and tyranny. And then the catechon restraining Satan somehow, being a holder of political office that can restrain the future use of the political office. I think he's often drawn the comparison to Nero and Claudius. I think it's very hard to take that framing. And Peter does this very carefully because I think he knows some of the further implications. But I think there's if you just accept the premise, and maybe you should reject the premise instead, but if you just accept the premise that there's this duel between the catechon and the Antichrist, imitates and maybe even eventually supersedes the catechon and runs the kind of one world government into the ground. The Antichrist, or the catechon, tries to restrain the Antichrist by creating the one world government, and that tragically leads to the Antichrist taking over the one world government. And maybe this is a reason to reject the premise, but I think the very straightforward takeaway from that is maybe we're just being ruled by the Antichrist.
Some people are saying. There's an interesting.
Some people are saying.
That's right. I think that you could view this as an archetype. I mean, Peter likes to say the line between political theology and political philosophy and political theology is political philosophy asks the question, one world or none. And you have the right question of the world state in political philosophy. And then the political theology asks the question, Antichrist or apocalypse. When you put it that way, the obvious answer is none of the above. Can we find a way around this? And so to the extent that Antichrist is a kind of condition of false unity, it's that the era of television, right? The condition of false unity that leads to stagnation. An apocalypse is real violence that leads to real innovation, real violence that gets out of control. The thing you want to find is a way between stagnation and controlled stagnation or managed decline, or out of control innovation and destruction. You want to find a middle ground. And so there are catechonic forces. Tobias Huber and Brett Hobart have called them kind of catechonic technologies. Find civilizational pathways that preserve dynamism, but get us out of this sort of, keep us from being imprisoned in the Tower of Babel. And it's possible that the internet or a certain kind of internet technology is part of the story.
It's very hard to put this in the Girardian frame. Here's how I think it has to end. There's, a mimetic desire, but that really breaks apart in two ways. there's the distinction between jealousy and envy. You can see someone with something, with a life, and say, I want to make that life for myself. Or you can see someone with something and say, I want them not to have. And that first one's jealousy, second one's envy. And the former, responsible for many great things, I think. Imitation in a positive way. Many great statesmen try to imitate their ancestors, other great statesmen before them. That's very mimetic, but I don't think it's mimetic in a way that takes away from either that ancestor or from the person at large, or from the society at large. It's in many ways a positive. It's a mimesis that enriches. And once again, it just goes back to a belief in higher and lower human natures, and not just between different people, but within each person. And I think that the way it all ends is us just making the discernment that, envy is bad and jealousy. Okay, jealousy is not always good, but it's much, much less destructive than envy. That the person who is eyeing the other person's slice, that is, or not even just eyeing it for themselves, not even just taking, but purely destroying, that those people are in fact just bad. That there is an element of both individual people and there is an element of yourself that you should really consider is just bad and is just something that should be punished, that you cannot, you don't even want to relate to that kind of bestial part of yourself. That is just a sin. And it's very hard, of course. It's much easier to say this in theory than it is to say it in practice. There's all sorts of social deception. Every envious movement now, there's much less Satan, much more Antichrist, where, the Antichrist is a version that imitates Christ. The Satan just says, don't you want that person destroyed? And the Antichrist will say, don't you want to destroy this person for the people, for justice, for equality? And there's just one more jump that you need to actually have discernment. And that almost feels too easy. I don't want to present it as an easy task, but here's the path towards that. First thing is delegitimation of the Antichrist, delegitimation of Rawls. Not saying that Rawls is the Antichrist, however, maybe the TV screen is the Antichrist, but the delegitimation of this kind of one world government, one world totalitarian state, one world totalitarian. I think we already, this is something that I think Peter could talk more about, the state as a kind of action legitimizing machine versus as a thought legitimizing machine. I think we already have the one world thought legitimizing machine. And yeah, I think it's the Antichrist. And first that needs to get delegitimized. And I think there is both discernment in just a raw satanic sense, and there is higher discernment on virtue, discernment on action, discernment on principle, that is already reemerging. I think that's a lot of the tech right. I think that's a lot of the meritocracy movement. And I think it will continue. I think it will get better. And you don't want to put a time and a date. We will not know the date or the hour
of
the apocalypse, but
Peter says maybe the century.
Maybe.
But no, I think there's a great line in the amazing movie Pacific Rim where Stacker Pentecost, one of the best names of a character ever, says, today we cancel the apocalypse. And I think that's if you're on the tech, that's a good mantra to have. It's like Elon's, what did you do today? What did you do this week? Like your goal should be I canceled the apocalypse a little bit this week.
Yeah.
Or the Antichrist.
Yeah, we're canceling the Antichrist. We're dunking on the Antichrist. The Antichrist is posting, and then we're just like,
biggest burns, absolute sick burns.
We're ratioing the Antichrist. We're doing it, yeah.
One day at a time, my man.
I mean, there was that like dissertation. Okay, no, I too much internet.
All right, time to log. Yeah, enough internet for today.
Yeah, and if you've been listening to this 3.5 hour podcast, you should perhaps consider that's enough internet as well.
All right, thanks, everybody.